Chapter 585. There were many factions within the true martial university. However, all of its disciples would stand united against the external forces no matter what. And this was especially true for Yi Shiwen and Gao Lingxiu. Yi Shiwen didn't have a very close relationship with Gao Lingxiu. However, she wasn't his enemy either, unlike those members of the law enforcement hall. So, it was impossible that she would sit back and watch Yi Shiwen being killed at the hands of young Master Jinxiu. Moreover, she wouldn't be able to explain herself to the high-level authorities if she did so. After all, Yi Shiwen wasn't an insignificant person. His death would surely mean something. He was a Heaven's Pride expert of this generation. In fact, he was the strongest among all the Heaven's Pride experts. Therefore, the high-level experts would be shaken if he died at the hands of this young Master Jinxiu. It was one thing if Yi Shiwen had died in a battle outside. However, it was a whole another story if he died in front of her. On top of that, she disliked young Master Jinxiu. Lingxiu, do you want to stop me? You want to stop me for this insignificant man? Good, very good. I'm even more hurt now. He must die. Young Master Jinxiu coldly said. He wouldn't spare Yi Shiwen just because Gao Lingxiu was trying to stop him. Sister, let me deal with this. You don't need to fight this petty man, Yi Shiwen said. However, his words had surprised Gao Lingxiu since she hadn't anticipated that he would say so. In fact, it seemed as if he simply didn't give a damn about young Master Jinxiu. She too didn't like young Master Jinxiu. However, Half-Step Great Sage was after all Half-Step Great Sage. She was obviously confident that she could take him on since she had undisclosed strength. However, it baffled her how Yi Shiwen could be so confident. Very well. Let me kill you. Young Master Jinxiu couldn't tolerate anymore. A big hand suddenly stretched out. It then transformed into a terrifying huge hand, and swept down towards Yi Shiwen to grab him. His lungs almost exploded with rage as he saw Yi Ziwen's appearance. What Gao Lingxiu had mentioned about young Master Jinxiu was right, that young Master Jinxiu was an obstinate and self-opinionated person. He had no problem with acting arrogantly himself. But he didn't like to see other people acting arrogantly in front of him. And Gao Lingxiu was obviously his exclusive property in his opinion. So, he couldn't tolerate when other people interfered between them. Gao Lingxiu was defending Yi Shiwen in front of him. This was unforgivable in his opinion. He had launched an attack on Yi Shiwen because he wanted to teach Gao Lingxiu a lesson. He wanted to let her know that she mustn't get too close to other men. Young Master Jinxiu's behavior was certainly rude and unreasonable. However, his strength was the real deal. The big hand that had swept out contained the world principles in it. These principles were boiling. After all, Half-Step Great Sage Realm touched upon the two words Great Sage. Young Master Jinxiu's soul had also faintly begun to transform, and a kind of dreadful coercion smashed down upon Yi Shiwen as a result. This was the coercion of Great Sage Realm. It was also the most dreadful attack for an expert below Great Sage Realm. It was very hard to withstand unless one had already undergone soul transformation. However, Yi Shiwen looked unfazed by it. He was standing motionless. The big hand suddenly smashed down. It had grabbed and exploded the void. Consequently, it became difficult to breathe for the attendants of the 10,000 Treasures building. These semi-sage experts weren't considered as bad cultivators on ordinary days. However, they differed by a huge margin from a half-step great sage expert. And the disparity in strength had vividly and thoroughly manifested this time. Bang! The big hand finally pounded on the ground and opened up a seemingly bottomless hole on the solid floor of the 10,000 Treasures building. Then, endless spirit energies instantly rushed inside the hole. Young Master Jinxiu's complexion suddenly changed. He hadn't anticipated that he wouldn't be able to catch Yi Shiwen. He just hadn't thought of this outcome. Yi Shiwen should have been overwhelmed by his coercion. His coercion should have made it hard for Yi Shiwen to escape. In fact, it should have shaken him to the core. This coercion couldn't be seen. However, its effect was the real deal. He simply hadn't anticipated that Yi Shiwen would transform into a golden light and would escape from his hands at the last moment. I hadn't expected that you would have a trick up your sleeve. It's no wonder that an insignificant person of sage realm like you has dared to provoke me. Young Master Jin Xiu sneered as he stepped out. Then his overwhelming aura swept out. And it seemed as if the shadows of countless immortals had appeared behind him in an instant. This was the projection of the creative concept of Emergence School's devastating emergence technique. As per the rumors, the practitioners of the devastating emergence technique would levitate heavenwards to become martial immortals if they practiced this technique to an extremely profound condition. However, it was considered a rumor because it was merely a legend. No one had ever practiced this technique to that extent. Still, the destructive emergence technique was an extremely exceptional martial art. Its formidable power was unpredictable and mysterious. The shadow of every immortal looked scary and intimidating. They were floating in the air like true immortals. And all of them were chanting scriptures. In fact, it seemed as if their chanting voices had resounded since ancient times. Their voices were brimming with vigor. This was truly an exceptional martial art. The more the shadows of the immortals congealed behind him, the more it showed how strong his destructive emergence technique truly was. In fact, a country of immortals had been formed. Young Master Jin Xiu then broke through the sky and levitated heavenward by depending on the power of these immortals. This was the fundamental purpose of the emergence school. Boy, let me attack with all my strength. You're very arrogant. You should have merely closed your eyes and accepted your death. It would have been over by now. But you've truly angered me now. So, I must give you a brutal death. Young Master Jin Xiu's complexion turned sinister as he said. Then, his aura swept out in all directions in an overwhelming manner. It filled the entire 10,000 Treasures building and made it difficult for Yi Shiwen to conceal his presence. It seemed as if the entire 10,000 Treasures building had transformed into a domain of immortals in an instant. Countless immortals could be seen in this immortal domain. And they were chasing after the evil spirits that had disrespected them with swords in their hands. It seemed that they would defeat those evil spirits in an instant. The many experts present around the 10,000 Treasures building began to retreat in quick succession in order to avoid sustaining injuries at the hands of young Master Jin Xiu. After all, they could get badly injured by such an indiscriminate attack. And they would have no place where they could go and cry if that happened. Gao Ling Xiu stood motionless like a big rock under this overwhelming coercion. But her complexion didn't look good at this time. She would have attacked and engaged young Master Jin Xiu in battle by now if Yi Shiwen hadn't asked her not to get involved via the divine sense. I've found where you are. You can't run. Young Master Jin Xiu sneered. He had found out where Yi Shiwen was hiding. So, his incomparably terrifying coercion of the half-step Great Sage realm overwhelmingly swept out towards the corner of the room. The space trembled in the face of this coercion. And the spirit energies in the surroundings rushed over from everywhere. They then congealed together to form a huge hand, and this hand then went forward to cover the corner. The big hand emitted splendid divine beams. It seemed as if countless gods were chanting scriptures inside it. This was the most dreadful aspect of the destructive emergence technique. It seemed as if the martial immortals themselves had broken the space and arrived in this world. It was an extremely terrifying scene. However, a golden light jumped out from that corner at this time. And a fist emerged out of that golden light immediately after that. The space inside the 10,000 Treasures building had looked extremely strong. But it instantly broke down under this fist. The space shattered like a mirror, and cracks proliferated in all directions from its middle like a spider's web. It seemed as if the time had stopped all of a sudden. The surrounding space transformed into a star field, and that fist transformed into a big star and smashed down. Young Master Jin Xiu's complexion underwent a drastic change as a result. After all, he hadn't anticipated that Yi Shiwen could have such incredible strength. His big hand had been crushed into fragments by Yi Ziwen's fist attack. And this was a tight slap to his face. He had thought that Yi Shiwen would dodge his attack. Therefore, Yi Shiwen would be like a piece of meat on the chopping board as long as he locked onto him. He could chop him in any way that he wished. However, Yi Ziwen's attack had completely toppled his anticipation. and he had realized that Yi Shiwen indeed had the power to fight back. However, he didn't get much time to ponder as Yi Zaiwen's fist had already arrived in front of him. So, he promptly shot his palm. It seemed as if countless immortals had constituted this palm, as if it could destroy the heaven and tear even the gods and devils to shreds. Bang! A dreadful collision occurred between the two sides. The two incomparably great forces collided in midair, transformed into an energy storm, and swept across all directions. All kinds of defense-type matrix formations got activated inside the 10,000 Treasures building in response to this collision. This force had already gone past the limit of the 10,000 Treasures building's bearing. Therefore, those matrix formations had been quickly activated to isolate the building from the fight of these two individuals. However, the boundless energy storm destroyed countless defensive matrix formations in an instant. But then, even more matrix formations got activated in the next moment. Layer upon layer of protection eliminated this terrifying force. The entire 10,000 Treasures building might have collapsed without these matrix formations. Ah! Young Master Jin Xiu screamed. His body had been hit by the explosion. He repeatedly retreated, and ended up crushing the floor into fine powder with every step that he took. His entire arm had been busted up by the dreadful force. His entire arm had been crippled by just one fist. However, that one fist had carried Yi Zaiwen's peerless fist pressure. It was an extremely dreadful feeling. He had felt as if his entire arm would fall apart in the next moment. Moreover, the entire protection layer of real elemental energy on his body and his defense-type divine tools had been shattered in a flash. Therefore, he could only tremble with fear in the face of Yi Zaiwen's fist pressure. Young Master Jin Xiu screamed in pain. He hadn't expected that Yi Shiwen could be so ferocious. His one fist, just one fist, had nearly exploded his entire arm. Was there truly that big a disparity between him and Yi Shiwen? How is this possible? Young Master Jin Xiu was in disbelief as he thought this. He was an outstanding talent of his generation. He was an elite disciple in the Emergent School. However, he had fallen headfirst here. He still wanted to compete for the supreme position of the Emergent School in the future. He still wanted to run amok in the entire world. So, how could he be defeated by a nobody of Sage Realm? Impossible. I'm not willing to accept this. Young Master Jin Xiu roared, and a mysterious force began to surge on his body. Then, his crippled arm began to heal at a speed that was visible to the naked eye. The sage experts would get this ability to regenerate their body once they had successfully completed the transformation of their body. However, how could Yi Shiwen allow him to make a comeback? Yi Shiwen sneered and stepped forward. The world began to shake under his footsteps. In fact, it seemed as if it would collapse. Then a fist swept out. It transformed into a big star and smashed down. The dreadful fist pressure proliferated in the surroundings. The young Master Jin Xiu shivered like an ant under the pressure of Yi Zaiwen's fist. Chapter 586. What the hell is going on? Young Master Jin Xiu has been completely crushed. He doesn't even have the power to fight back. A semi-sage attendant of the 10,000 Treasures building became terrified when he saw the scene before his eyes. Who the hell do you think you are that you think you can protect our true martial university? Yi Shiwen sneered again and again. Young Master Jin Xiu had already curled up into a ball under Yi Zaiwen's fist pressure. His energy had gotten exhausted. His eyes were revealing fear and resentment at the same time. There was even more hatred for Yi Shiwen in his eyes now. He wished he could rip Yi Shiwen in half. However, Yi Shiwen didn't care. After all, who would care about a dead person? Impossible. You can't kill me. Otherwise, the Emergent School won't spare your true martial university. Your true martial university will perish under the heavenly might of our Emergent School. Young Master Jin Xiu finally became frightened when he saw the killing intention inside Yi Zaiwen's eyes. Moreover, this killing intention was hardly concealed. So, he had finally realized that Yi Shiwen was going to kill him. He hadn't thought that Yi Shiwen could kill him at first. He simply hadn't thought about this possibility. In his opinion, he could trample Yi Shiwen to death like an ant whenever he felt like. He had only wanted to show off in front of Gao Lingxiu. However, the fact turned out to be contrary to everyone's expectations. He had been defeated by that very ant-like person. Young Master Jin Xiu had never faced such humiliation in his entire life. He had been defeated by this so-called insignificant man of sage realm whom he had looked down on. "Young friend, please stop." The voice of an old man suddenly came from the upper floor of the 10,000 Treasures building at this moment. Simultaneously, the mighty coercion of Great Sage Realm pressed down upon Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen was startled since he had realized that a great sage had assumed personal command of this 10,000 Treasures building. However, he had thought of this possibility earlier. After all, the 10,000 Treasures building had risen to power and fame within such a short time. So, how would they have established such a big institution under the attention of many other forces if they didn't possess tyrannical backing? The true martial world was especially a place where all kinds of forces were mixed together. Wind Dragon City had become much more chaotic than it used to be a decade ago. Only the experts of the true martial world and some nearby star fields had been operating in the city back then. However, more and more forces had recently arrived here from the far stretches of the space. They had then set up their outposts here one after another. The 10,000 Treasures building had become very famous amidst all this chaos. Therefore, Yi Shiwen couldn't have believed that it didn't have a great sage expert to assume personal command. Yi Shiwen felt a boundless coercion of Great Sage Realm suppressing him the moment that Great Sage expert set into action. He was only an expert of initial stage of Great Sage Realm. However, he was obviously much more tyrannical than the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo. This man must have entered the Great Sage Realm at least 300 years ago. And that's why he possessed such profound martial power. The coercion of Great Sage Realm had a strong deterrence effect on the experts below Great Sage Realm. After all, it could impact the depth of one's soul. However, Yi Shiwen only became slightly startled by it. And he quickly broke free from this coercion. His soul had also been transformed in its entirety by now. Therefore, the Great Sage's coercion of this level couldn't faze him. He had stopped for a split second. But it was enough to give young Master Jin Xiu an opportunity. After all, he had also cultivated to the initial stage of half-step Great Sage Realm. And he also possessed tyrannical strength. In fact, he wouldn't have been in such a miserable situation if he hadn't bumped into an even bigger fiend like Yi Shiwen. He had managed to escape from the attack of Yi Ziwen's Big Bang Stardust Fist within such a short span of time. Young Master Jin Xiu's entire body was trembling, and his complexion had turned a mix of blue and red. He was angry as well as embarrassed at the moment. This was because he hadn't had any room to retaliate in front of Yi Shiwen. In fact, he had nearly died like a dog a moment ago. "Brother Yi, don't kill him." Gao Lingxiu's voice sounded at this moment. She was standing nearby. It wasn't that her reaction speed was extremely slow. Instead, Yi Ziwen's speed was extremely fast. He had destroyed young Master Jin Xiu's defenses in an instant. She had initially believed that Yi Shiwen would be the one to fall into the disadvantageous position. In fact, it would have been far beyond her imagination if he had even managed to keep up with him. However, this had been a one-sided fight in which Yi Shiwen had easily defeated young Master Jin Xiu. Yi Shiwen continued to attack. He stepped across the space between himself and his opponent in an instant, and then put his foot on his head. He then said, "I'm sparing the life of a dog like you since Sister Gao has pleaded for leniency on your behalf. However, you have to hand over your wealth to me as the price for sparing your life." He neither gave a damn about the 10,000 Treasures building, nor about its great sage expert. However, he decided to give face to Gao Lingxiu. After all, he already had a big enmity with the law enforcement hall. And Gao Lingxiu was an outstanding disciple of Merit Palace Hall, which was a big faction in true martial university. Yi Shiwen certainly didn't need to curry favor with her. However, he also didn't need to fall into enmity with her. In fact, it would be advantageous for him if he maintained a good relation with her. Yi Shiwen wasn't fond of agreeing to other people's demands. However, he also wasn't a person who didn't know how to accommodate to circumstances. Yi Shiwen had put his foot on young Master Jin Xiu's head. and an incredibly huge force had locked young Master Jin Xiu down as a result. Therefore, young Master Jin Xiu couldn't move no matter how much he tried. Then, a dreadful coercion reached deep into his soul and firmly pressed him down on the ground. Great sage. Young Master Jin Xiu became panic-stricken as he found out that this coercion was of great sage level. It must be nearly as strong as that of the great sage expert of 10,000 treasures building who had set into action a while back. Is this guy before me a great sage expert? It would be normal for me to lose at his hands if he's truly a great sage expert. After all, I'm just an expert of half-step great sage realm. So, how could I possibly contend against a great sage expert? Yi Shiwen didn't know what this guy was thinking. So, he merely grabbed his body and seized countless heavenly treasures from him. This young master possessed many heavenly treasures since he was the core disciple of Emergent School and a half-step great sage expert. He certainly didn't possess as much wealth as Yi Shiwen did. However, he still had more than 200 million primary spirit dawn. Yi Shiwen continued to snatch away the countless primary spirit dawn. They were flying out from this guy's body just like a long river, and were being poured into the heavenly source mirror. So many primary spirit dawn. Those attendants of 10,000 treasures building couldn't help but swallow a mouthful of saliva. They exclaimed as they saw a large number of primary spirit dawn pouring out of young Master Jin Xiu's body like a long river, and then being poured into the heavenly source mirror by Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen secretly sighed with emotion when he saw that this extraordinary young Master Jin Xiu had possessed 700 million primary spirit dawn on him. The Emergent School is filthy rich. Only a core disciple's overall wealth is worth more than 1 billion primary spirit dawn. In fact, this wealth can be compared to that of a great sage expert. However, he had ignored the fact that he himself possessed heavenly treasures worth more than 3 billion primary spirit dawn. This was because he believed that his heavenly treasures had limited use for him unless they were exchanged for primary spirit dawn. However, Yi Shiwen didn't know that young Master Jin Xiu wasn't so rich in reality. The fact was that young Master Jin Xiu had come on a mission this time. He had intended to discuss about his marriage with the true martial university. He had planned on marrying Gao Ling Xiu before making his return to his sect. And all this wealth was meant to be used as a betrothal gift. Afterwards, he had seen Yi Shiwen selling those things in the list, and an idea had popped into his mind. He would use merely 100 million primary spirit dawn to buy those things. After all, this would mean that he could embezzle the rest of the wealth that he had on him. And he had thought that it would be better if he forcefully snatched Yi Zaiwen's stuff instead of killing him. However, his own wealth had now fallen into Yi Zaiwen's hands. Young Master Jin Xiu unceasingly issued bursts of tyrannical power from his body under Yi Zaiwen's suppression when he saw his seemingly countless wealth being taken away. After all, he wasn't willing to let Yi Shiwen do this. I'm a disciple of Emergent School. You can't do this to me. Otherwise, I swear to you that your true martial university will be exterminated. Young Master Jin Xiu shouted. He had lost his mind as he helplessly watched his wealth being plundered. You truly have a death wish. I had decided to spare you. But I didn't know that you would be this stubborn, Yi Shiwen replied. Simultaneously, the killing intention flickered in his eyes. He didn't conceal it as he glared at young Master Jin Xiu. Then, a force suddenly built up in his foot, and it seemed as if he would stamp on young Master Jin Xiu's head and crush it. Suddenly, a gasping voice came from the upper floor of the 10,000 treasures building at this moment. Young friend, please show some mercy. The space inside the 10,000 treasures building fluctuated, and a figure came out from the void. It was a middle-aged man dressed in black clothes. His body was emitting a strong and intimidating aura. He was that great sage expert of the 10,000 treasures building. What do you want? Do you want to stop me? Yi Zaiwen's complexion turned somewhat bad as his attempt had been foiled by this great sage expert of the 10,000 treasures building. You've appeared now? What were you doing earlier? Why had this great sage expert neither said nor done anything when young Master Jin Xiu launched an attack on me? Could it be that he thinks that true martial university has declined to such an extent? To such an extent that even a newly emerged force like the 10,000 Treasures building isn't giving importance to me? The senior great sage expert clearly felt the anger in Yi Zaiwen's tone. And he also knew that perhaps he had committed a mistake. It would have meant that he wasn't biased towards any one of these two individuals if he hadn't appeared from the beginning to the end. However, wasn't it obvious that he wanted to support the emergent school's young master Jin Xiu since he had arrived at this moment? Therefore, it wasn't surprising that Yi Shiwen was so angry. However, he had already showed up to mediate at this juncture. So, he couldn't retreat. Young friend, this is the 10,000 Treasures building. So, we have no alternative but to interfere in whatever happens here, the great sage expert slowly said. He believed that he was already giving enough respect to Yi Shiwen by not showing any superiority and speaking so politely. However, the irritated and ridiculing expressions on Yi Zaiwen's face grew more intense. He has realized that he should come out and interfere only now? What was he doing earlier? In that case, I'm sorry. I won't put you in the spot. Yi Shiwen suddenly kicked after saying this. And young Master Jin Xiu's body immediately went out flying like a cannonball. He collided with a wall of the 10,000 Treasures building and blasted open a huge hole. Then, he further went flying into the Wind Dragon City. Yi Shiwen transformed into a golden light and flew after him. The complexion of that great sage expert of 10,000 Treasures building turned ashen. And his entire body trembled because of anger. After all, he had been disregarded by Yi Shiwen. Nobody had ignored him like this since the time he had entered the great sage realm. However, he had been ignored as if he was a stranger in this instance. And the one who had done this was merely an insignificant sage expert. Now, I'm also furious, the great sage expert of 10,000 Treasures building gritted his teeth in anger and said. Chapter 587. The 10,000 Treasures building's great sage expert kept looking at Yi Zaiwen's back as it disappeared into the distance with his gloomy and cold vision. He hesitated for a long time, but didn't pursue him. This was because he knew that doing this would be equivalent to thoroughly opposing the true martial university. After all, the true martial university would certainly defend its students and disciples. He would certainly have good relations with the emergent school if he followed Yi Shiwen. However, he must maintain good relations with both sides as a businessman. However, he still caught and crushed a chunk of void. You even destroyed my martial cultivation. Young Master Jin Xiu looked at Yi Shiwen in disbelief as his body curled up in the ruins of a house. Yi Shiwen had annihilated the sea of energy inside his dantian in one kick. He had shattered the entirety of his meridians and abolished his martial cultivation. He was feeling even worse than what a person who was about to die would feel. His heart had been filled with bitter hatred a moment ago. He had conjured all kinds of malicious schemes. I must look for an opportunity to exterminate this ant-like sage expert after I get out of this mess. However, all of his plots had vanished in just one kick. The martial cultivation of a person was their entire foundation. So, he had become a waste without his martial cultivation. Who would listen to a useless person like him now? Therefore, it would now be very difficult to make the emergent school take revenge for him. Strength was considered above all other things in this world. Whether a person had any worth or not was judged according to their strength. It could be said that his status had suddenly transformed. He had dropped down to the level of an ordinary person from that of an aloof core disciple of a great force. Such a feeling was so unbearable for him that he felt like banging his head on a wall. You've destroyed his martial cultivation? Gao Ling Xiu was left in shock as soon as she chased out after them and saw this scene. The entirety of young Master Jin Xiu's martial power had vanished in thin air. Yi Shiwen nodded and said, "This guy was unwilling to let go. I haven't killed him out of consideration for Sister's reputation. Instead, I've only made him learn his place. He had dared to force Sister into marry him. He was going too far. He hadn't killed young Master Jin Xiu. However, such punishment was even worse than death. Jin Xiu was now suffering both mentally and physically. This guy had been nagging Gao Ling Xiu for many years. So, She was certainly feeling exceptionally happy to see him get crippled. However, she still warned Yi Shiwen, "Brother Yi, do you know who he is? He is the emergent school's current representative to the true martial world. Even the ordinary great sage experts speak to him with respect. This is also the reason why I haven't been able to get rid of him this entire time." Representative? Pumph. This is the true martial world, not the emergence world. Those people of the emergent school may be powerful. However, there is a saying, a strong dragon can't repress a local snake. The emergent school thinks that they can go wild here. However, they still fall short, Yi Shiwen coldly replied. This doing is equal to inviting enormous troubles. I'm afraid the law enforcement hall's people won't let this opportunity to pin you down go in vain, Gao Ling Xiu said. She had been outside the true martial university for years. However, she was obviously still very concerned regarding its matters. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been aware of the enmity between Yi Shiwen and the law enforcement hall. Anyway, I already have lots of troubles. So, one more wouldn't kill me, right? The law enforcement hall's people wouldn't give up on picking a fight with me even if this matter hadn't taken place, Yi Shiwen said. It wasn't that he didn't know that he would come across enormous trouble after destroying young Master Jin Xiu's martial cultivation. However, Yi Shiwen wouldn't have shown any mercy even if he were given another chance. After all, young Master Jin Xiu had annoyed him beyond limit. In fact, his behavior alone was akin to courting death. Moreover, young Master Jin Xiu's great wealth had alleviated his urgent monetary crisis. He had suddenly obtained wealth worth almost 1 billion. And 700 million primary spirit dawn were among that wealth. It had suddenly made up for Yi Zaiwen's shortage of primary spirit dawn. He could summon the Star Colossus avatar to fight now that he had so many primary spirit dawn in his hands. It could be said that this had boosted his confidence. You'll surely regret this. You'll surely regret this. Young Master Jin Xiu's face was brimming with bitter resentment as he roared at Yi Shiwen. The look on his face seemed like the final radiance of a setting sun. I'll ensure that you meet a tragic end. Countless experts inside the Wind Dragon City sent out their divine senses to probe. Isn't he young Master Jin Xiu of Emergent School? How has he gotten thrashed so miserably? This man thought that he could always charge around violently since he had the support of Emergent School behind him. He had even killed many sage experts who had bumped into him by mistake. But who has he provoked this time that he has received such treatment? Yeah, this young Master Jin Xiu is arrogant and despotic and annoys everyone. However, he is still an expert of half-step great sage realm. So, it's impossible to beat him like this unless the attacker is a great sage expert. Has he offended a great sage expert? Some people made speculation, and many agreed to it. The sage experts were nothing in the Wind Dragon City at present. The real ones in command were those great sage experts. Therefore, he had to have offended a great sage expert. Only a great sage expert could make the condition of an expert of half-step great sage realm so pitiful. Impossible. Young Master Jin Xiu is certainly arrogant. However, he isn't brainless. He mustn't have provoked a great sage. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been alive at this time. Some people completely disagreed with this speculation. I know of that person. He is Yi Shiwen. Don't you people remember? He is a top-tier Heaven's Pride expert of the true martial university. Yi Shiwen had left a deep impression on people's hearts after his fight with Pang Yongbo. After all, that fight had also taken place in the Wind Dragon City. Therefore, an expert recognized him not too long after, even though he had returned after so many years. People might have been a bit surprised if young Master Jin Xiu had provoked a great sage expert. But they wouldn't have been baffled by such outcome. However, the person who had beaten up young Master Jin Xiu turned out to be Yi Shiwen. Suddenly, the hissing sound of people holding their breaths resounded. Everyone was left in shock after they came to know that the person who had beaten up young Master Jin Xiu so brutally was in fact Yi Shiwen. So, they had held their breaths. Many people were still impressed with Yi Shiwen because of his fight with Pang Yongbo back then. After all, Yi Zaiwen's performance had been stunning at that time. In fact, Many people had been optimistic about Pang Yongbos's chances of winning that fight. After all, he had been just 10 or so years old, and had already cultivated to such an extent. Everyone had believed that that young genius would definitely not take too many years to reach to the Sage Realm, or even Great Sage Realm. However, such a genius had lost at Yi Ziwen's hands. Consequently, a very profound impression of Yi Shiwen had been left on their hearts. They still had the same deep impression of him even after so many years. Yi Shiwen had been just an average Heaven's Pride expert of the younger generation back then. However, his opponent was an ambassador disciple of this session. And most people didn't dare to ignore this fact. However, Yi Shiwen had once again appeared after so many years. And he had beaten up this rampant young Master Jin Xiu like a dead dog as soon as he had arrived. This glorious feat had once again left the entire world in shock. After all, this was an expert of half-step Great Sage Realm, not a semi-sage expert. There was an entire realm in between the two. There was also a difference of cloud and mud between their statuses. Therefore, who apart from a Great Sage expert could dare to say that they could beat an expert of half-step Great Sage Realm like a dead dog? So, everyone had held their breaths when they saw this scene. Humph! Yi Shiwen coldly snorted when he heard that this young Master Jin Xiu was still roaring. The cold humph sound transformed into a dreadful sound wave, and swept out towards young Master Jin Xiu. Bang! Young Master Jin Xiu was once again blasted away and sent flying. It was now impossible for him to defend himself since his martial cultivation had already been destroyed by Yi Shiwen. Perhaps, this simple attack would have crushed him to death if he didn't possess the body of a half-step Great Sage level expert. He didn't die. However, he straight up fainted after colliding with many buildings. Everyone trembled in fear when they saw this scene. It had freaked them out. After all, a core expert of half-step Great Sage Realm had been deposed in such a way. He didn't even have any strength to fight back. He had been blown away like a dead dog and had passed out. Brother Yi, I'm afraid that you won't be in a small trouble when the time comes. Gao Ling Xiu looked at Yi Shiwen with a conflicted expression. Yi Ziwen's action had definitely made her happy. However, she was worried that it would also cause trouble for him. Humph! I'm not afraid of any trouble. I won't be afraid even if a Great Sage expert of Emergent School arrives. It doesn't matter how many other experts arrive. I'll kill them all. But I don't believe that they will dare to arrive in the true martial university to fight, Yi Shiwen disdainfully said. He could escape if an average Great Sage expert chased him. However, he could simply summon the Star Colossus avatar and kill an expert of initial stage of Great Sage Realm. He had become much more proficient in controlling the Star Colossus avatar in the last few years. He had also fought with several Great Sage experts during this period. They were mostly experts of the initial stage of Great Sage Realm. However, he had also fought with an exceptional expert of the intermediate stage of Great Sage Realm. It had been a catastrophic battle. It had ended in Yi Ziwen's defeat, and he had been forced to escape in the end. However, he had obtained an extremely valuable battle experience from that fight. His primary Spirit Dawn had exhausted precisely because he had fought with several experts of Great Sage Realm. In fact, he had consumed more than 100 million primary Spirit Dawn every time he fought. After all, such fights would consume his primary Spirit Dawn at every moment, just like a bottomless swallowing monster. He was now assured that he could kill an expert of initial stage of Great Sage Realm. Therefore, his disregarding attitude towards that 10,000 treasures building's Great Sage initial stage expert wasn't just for show. In fact, Yi Shiwen wouldn't have minded killing that Great Sage expert to establish his prestige if he had dared to intervene again. Furthermore, sister, you can also testify. It was his fault. He wanted to rob my heavenly treasures. So he deserves to die. In fact, I would have killed him already if I didn't care about sister's reputation. Yi Shiwen mentioned again and again that he had given consideration to Gao Ling Xiu's face. It was obvious that he wanted to spare no effort in order to impress her. She wouldn't have been worthy of his attention if she were just an ordinary expert. However, Gao Ling Xiu had deeply concealed her strength and hadn't revealed it. Moreover, even Yi Shiwen couldn't estimate her undisclosed strength. Even Yi Mo admired her. So, she was naturally out of the ordinary. Gao Ling Xiu nodded. But she was still somewhat worried. There is no such thing as solid reasoning in this world where strength trumps all rules. Let's not talk about him. Sister had said a while ago that the Merit Palace Hall can buy all kinds of heavenly treasures, right? Yi Shiwen asked. That great sage expert of 10,000 treasures building had left a very bad impression on Yi Shiwen a moment ago. Therefore, he had changed his plan of selling his heavenly treasures to the 10,000 treasures building. Chapter 588. Let's not talk about him. Sister had said a while ago that the Merit Palace Hall can buy all kinds of heavenly treasures? Yi Ziwen's eyes flashed as he looked at Gao Ling Xiu and said, Gao Ling Xiu deserved to be called an outstanding female expert. She had switched to her good mood in an instant. She had stopped worrying about young Master Jin Xiu's matter for the time being. Thus, our Merit Palace Hall is also interested in the heavenly treasures that are mentioned in your list, Gao Ling Xiu said. Merit Palace Hall was basically the place where every disciple used to exchange their accumulated merit points for all kinds of heavenly treasures. However, these heavenly treasures naturally didn't fall from sky. The Merit Palace Hall had to use all kinds of methods to purchase these heavenly treasures. In fact, this was a very common practice in every force. Well, give 1 billion primary spirit dawn or an equivalent amount of points of the university for these things, Gao Ling Xiu said. I'll exchange them for 1 billion primary spirit dawn. Yi Shiwen replied. He would have chosen the points initially when his strength was very weak. This was because he couldn't obtain good things from the university unless he provided huge amounts of points in exchange. However, it was very easy for him to earn points by completing missions as per his current level of strength. Moreover, the primary spirit dawn were obviously more important to him as compared to the points at present. He already had 700 million primary spirit dawn. He had seized them from young Master Jin Xiu. So, he would have a total of 1.7 billion primary spirit dawn after having these 1 billion primary spirit dawn. This would be enough for him to cultivate up to the great sage realm even if his insane consumption of primary spirit dawn during cultivation was taken into account. However, these 1.7 billion primary spirit dawn could enable the Star Colossus avatar to fight just 3 times. 1.7 billion primary spirit dawn was an astronomical amount in other people's opinion. However, it was barely enough to make the Star Colossus avatar fight 3 times as far as Yi Shiwen was concerned. However, these were 3 life-saving opportunities for him. After all, he could escape even if a formidable great sage expert attacked him in case he had the support of the Star Colossus avatar. Therefore, Yi Ziwen's confidence would indeed be boosted after having 1.7 billion primary spirit dawn. Gao Ling Xiu was also very straightforward. She didn't hesitate, and immediately threw a storage ring containing 1 billion primary spirit dawn towards Yi Shiwen. These were top-quality primary spirit dawn. In fact, there was a kind of small world composed of piles of these dawn inside the ring. It was a marvelous sight. Yi Shiwen had no choice but to sigh with emotion. These disciples who go out on special missions are very wealthy. ID just now discovered a wealth of over 1 billion primary spirit dawn on young Master Jin Xiu's body. And now, Gao Ling Xiu took out 1 billion primary spirit dawn as soon as I made the deal. She didn't hesitate at all in taking out 1 billion primary spirit dawn. However, I reckon not many people would dare to think about fighting with them. On one hand, they possess so much tyrannical strength that it's impossible to kill them unless a great sage expert attacks. On the other hand, one may have to face the crazy retaliation of the big forces that are backing these people if they dared to go against them. Yi Shiwen also didn't hesitate. He put the heavenly treasures that he had already prepared inside a storage ring and gave it to Gao Ling Xiu. Gao Ling Xiu swept her divine sense into the ring once to confirm that all the traded goods were present. Then her face immediately exposed a smile. After all, she had purchased so many urgently needed heavenly treasures in one fell swoop. It was naturally a big accomplishment for her. Brother Yi, what next? Are you planning to return for your appointment? Gao Lingxiu asked. She secretly sighed as her heart was overwhelmed with emotion. Yi Shiwen and Chao Yuyu's battle appointment. Yi Shiwen had shown no weakness even while facing Mu Xingjie, and he became a legend in the university because of it. A lot of people are already regretting that the top Heaven's Pride expert of this generation who has risen to fame so suddenly will die this time. After all, Chao Yuyu is much stronger than Yi Shiwen. He also used to be a Heaven's Pride expert back in the day. And it's hard to say how much stronger he has become now that several hundred years have passed since then. So, who would be optimistic about Yi Ziwen's chances in this battle appointment, which is going to happen only 10 years after their last meeting? She also wouldn't have been optimistic about Yi Ziwen's chances if she hadn't seen him in action with her own eyes. However, he was way too amazing. He had unexpectedly become tyrannical to such an extent in just about a decade's time. Of course. After all, some matters need to be ended quickly. Yi Shiwen sneered and replied. He had indeed left for Meteor World to complete Northern Dipper Organization's mission. However, he had another equally important reason for doing that. He wanted to avoid confrontation with Chao Yuyu and Mu Xingjie. After all, he hadn't even reached the Sage Realm at that time. So, it was very likely that he would have died if Chao Yuyu had launched an attack on him. On top of that, Mu Xingjie was also there. Chao Yuyu probably wouldn't have attacked Yi Shiwen before the time of battle appointment if Chao Yuyu still obeyed the rules. However, the same couldn't be said when it came to Mu Xingjie. After all, what kind of rules could be set for a man of his stature? He could have killed Yi Shiwen with the snap of his finger. And the higher-ups wouldn't have gotten time to react even if they had wanted to save him. After all, one person was a newly emerged Heaven's Pride expert, while the other possessed tyrannical talent. He possessed overbearing strength and unmatched battle experience. He had even performed an outstanding military service for the university. So, Yi Shiwen knew who they would have chosen. The higher-ups might have punished Mu Xingjie for inviting the rage of the hidden Star Peak. However, Yi Shiwen would have already died by then. Therefore, it wouldn't have mattered what punishment they would have given Mu Xingjie. After all, it would have been of no significance to him. Besides, Yi Shiwen had seen himself what his fellow eldest disciple of Hidden Star Peak had done when War Dead Star Peak had crossed the line and attacked the Hidden Star Peak. Big Brother had rushed into the private microcosm of the War Dead Star Peak and had chased down their head as well as their ancestral elder everywhere. They had been forced to flee in a distressed situation in the end. Therefore, Yi Shiwen knew that the rules and whatnot were only subjective. Yi Shiwen couldn't take that risk. Therefore, he had chosen to go to the Meteor World in order to stay far away from Mu Xingjie and Chao Yuyu. However, the situation was different now. Now, his strength had increased enormously. It could be said that he could suppress outstanding heroes with his current skills. Chao Yuyu wasn't a match for him now. And Mu Xingjie also couldn't kill him even if he personally attacked. Chao Yuyu's battle appointment had been like a hanging sword above him. But it was now the time to finally go back and wipe out this threat once and for all. Brother Yi, we can return together if that's the case. After all, my mission from 10 years ago has already been completed now that I've purchased these heavenly treasures. Gao Lingxiu smiled. However, hasn't Brother Yi ever thought about joining our Merit Palace Hall? Brother Yi can probably get a high position as per his current cultivation if he decides to join. Thereafter, our Merit Palace Hall won't sit idly and watch even if the law enforcement hall rose in revolt against you. Yi Shiwen shook his head and refused. He wasn't fond of bindings just like the other people of the Hidden Star Peak. There were certainly many benefits of joining the Merit Palace Hall. However, he would also get caught into handling trivial matters. He would unceasingly receive all kinds of tasks. And that would delay his cultivation in his opinion. In fact, he had joined Northern Dipper Organization precisely because he had seen that there was much freedom there. He could choose to go on a mission for them if he truly needed some items and was in need of points to trade. That's a pity, Gao Lingxiu said. However, she didn't continue to persuade him. She could see that Yi Shiwen had already made up his mind. Moreover, he seemed very firm on his decision. The two didn't stay there any longer and directly flew towards the true martial university. The current cultivation of both individuals was very high. So, it took them just half day's time to reach to the true martial world from the Wind Dragon City. They flew all the way inside the true martial world, and then flew towards the true martial university. They saw the true martial mountain range located at a distant place in the center of the true martial university and the cluster of cities in its periphery. However, Yi Shiwen hadn't seen much when he felt that the spirit energies present in the surroundings were rushing in towards the true martial university at a terrifying speed. Just ordinary air was left behind after the spirit energies had been sucked away. He felt as if a giant beast was lurking in these incomparably huge true martial mountains and was breathing. What is this? Yi Shiwen was startled. Someone is cultivating therein. I don't know what kind of cultivation method he practices. However, it seems that his breathing can unexpectedly make the world change its color. Guillemot said, it was widely known that experts had to consume a certain amount of spirit energies during cultivation, and there were 3 methods for that. The first one was to use spirit dawn and spirit stones. The second one was to use some special heavenly treasures which contained incredible spirit energies. And the last one was to directly absorb the spirit energies present in the atmosphere. The last method was clearly much more inefficient than the first 2. This was because the presence of spirit energies in the environment was very thin. On top of that, they weren't homogeneously distributed in the atmosphere. However, Yi Shiwen could see that this person was sucking in the amount of spirit energies contained in 1,000 primary spirit dawn with each breath. So, he secretly became startled. It's impossible for a sage expert to breath in such huge amounts of spirit energies. In fact, it's impossible for even a great sage expert to reach to such terrifying degree. This is simply world-shaking. However, Gao Ling Xiu soon cleared Yi Ziwen's confusion. This is Brother Mu Xingjie of Law Enforcement Hall. He is cultivating at this moment. It is said that he had returned a decade ago from the ancient ruins after obtaining enormous benefits. Now, he is undergoing closed-door training in order to make a breakthrough. It is said that he'll soon make this breakthrough, and it will become even more difficult to find a match for him in the university at that time. Gao Ling Xiu said, and shot a glance at Yi Shiwen. The clash between Yi Shiwen and a wisp of Mu Xingjie's soul had caused a sensation in the true martial university back then. But it wasn't because he had defeated Mu Xingjie's wisp of soul. Instead, it was because he had boldly challenged Mu Xingjie. Everyone had been left in shock. They could just say this: everyone in the Hidden Star Peak is abnormal. There isn't a single normal person among them. Yi Shiwen especially remembered that it hadn't made such huge noise when Mu Xingjie had started his closed-door training a decade ago. However, he could now feel that Mu Xingjie's strength was increasing by a bit with every breath that he was taking. Perhaps, it would be very difficult to find a rival for him by the time he came out. Yi Shiwen was just slightly surprised by the fact that Mu Xingjie hadn't come out of the closed-door training yet. However, he then recalled that it was normal for the great sage experts to continue closed-door training for decades or even centuries. Yi Shiwen felt butterflies in his belly. Yi Shiwen could summon the Star Colossus avatar to aid him. So, he was confident that it would be very difficult for Mu Xingjie to kill him even after Mu Xingjie had made a breakthrough. However, that didn't change the fact that Yi Ziwen's opponent was becoming increasingly powerful with each passing moment. Yi Shiwen and Gao Ling Xiu didn't stay in the periphery for a long time. They soon entered the true martial mountains. Thereafter they parted ways. Gao Ling Xiu returned to the Merit Palace Hall to report about the completion of her mission. However, Yi Shiwen didn't return to his abode on the metropolis' single peak. Instead, he returned to the Hidden Star Peak. Yi Shiwen is back. Yi Shiwen didn't conceal his presence after he entered inside the true martial mountains. Therefore, he was immediately discovered by many people who had sharp vision. Yi Ziwen's and Chao Yuyu's battle appointment had shaken everyone for a while a decade ago. Countless people had been looking forward to that fight. However, Yi Shiwen had disappeared afterwards, and hadn't appeared again. So, the rumor about Yi Shiwen escaping just before the battle had made noise for a while. The people of Law Enforcement Hall had especially dragged this matter. They just wouldn't let it go. A decade had passed in an instant, and most people had almost forgotten about this matter. But Yi Shiwen had appeared once again. Chapter 589. Yi Shiwen has returned. Am not mistaken. That's truly him. He has dared to return? Hadn't he escaped? Do you believe everything that the Law Enforcement Hall says? He has returned. So, doesn't it prove that the rumor that he had escaped was false? He has indeed returned. But will he be able to deal with Chao Yuyu? That's absolutely impossible. What was Yi Shiwen a dozen years ago? He wasn't even a sage expert. However, Chao Yuyu had already entered the sage accomplished realm by that time. And now he has advanced a step further and entered the initial stage of half-step Great Sage Realm. He'll certainly enter the Great Sage Realm within 100 years. Yi Shiwen may be very talented, but it's impossible for him to overtake Chao Yuyu. Anyway, the people of the Law Enforcement Hall aren't going to spare Yi Shiwen now that he has returned. A big battle will certainly take place once again. I saw that Yi Ziwen's aura is calm and steady. So, he has obviously entered the Sage Realm already. He has entered Sage Realm within such a short time. Moreover, his cultivation looks profound. Yi Shiwen hasn't let down the title of Heaven's Pride Expert. Heaven's Pride Expert? That's laughable. What's the use of Heaven's Pride Experts? So many talents arrive here every year. There are also some Heaven's Pride Experts among them. However, most of them eventually fall from sky. There are many geniuses in our true martial university, just like there are many dogs. So many people arrive here in every session. Throw a brick on these people, and 9 out of 10 people it falls on would turn out to be ordinary talents. Only one among them would turn out to be a super talent who could grow and become a great sage and have the last laugh. Countless people had started discussing spiritedly because of Yi Ziwen's return. In fact, his arrival seemed to have caused a sensation. The disciples of the Law Enforcement Hall were especially clamoring unceasingly. We would have spared Yi Ziwen's life if he had laid low for his entire life and not come here. However, he has dared to return. Does he have a death wish? The time of his death has come now that he has returned. He's very arrogant and despotic. After all, this is an offense towards our Law Enforcement Hall. However, everyone soon lost their voices. This was because all kinds of matrix formations of the Hidden Star Peak suddenly got activated not long after Yi Ziwen's return to the Hidden Star Peak. Especially the matrix formations that absorbed spirit energies got unleashed in full force. It seemed for a moment as if the world had lost its color. Countless spirit energies immediately began to surge towards the Hidden Star Peak. The situation didn't remain like earlier when the entire spirit energies were rushing towards the peak on which Mu Xingjie was. In fact, the majority of spirit energies in the surroundings had been snatched away almost in an instant. Mu Xingjie possessed incredible strength. On top of that, Hidden Star Peak seemed to have declined now even though it was once ranked among the top 10 powerful inheritances. However, a person would get scared to death if the Hidden Star Peak's profound and tyrannical background were to be explained casually to them. This represented the so-called saying a centipede dies, but never falls down. Not a single person had joined the Hidden Star Peak for many years prior to Yi Ziwen's generation. Still, nobody dared to mess with them. After all, the chiefs of Hidden Star Peak in every generation had been tyrannical people from the true martial university. Moreover, the heritage left behind by its experts of past generations was also a very important factor. This so-called background might not be visible on ordinary days. So, many people who didn't understand the situation of the Hidden Star Peak believed that it was easy to bully it. However, the people who were truly knowledgeable knew that the Hidden Star Peak wasn't dreadful because of a ferocious and unruly first disciple like Huang Wuji. Instead, the most terrifying aspect of Hidden Star Peak was that it possessed a terrifying background. For instance, Yi Shiwen had just now attracted 70 to 80% of the spirit energies of entire true martial mountains by launching the matrix formations. Mu Xingjie indeed possessed very tyrannical strength. However, The disparity between him and these matrix formations, which had been strengthened by the hidden star peaks ancestors of the previous generations, got prominently revealed all of a sudden. Yi Zaiwen's martial power was limited, so he could attract only 70 to 80% of the spirit energies in the atmosphere. However, not a bit of the spirit energies would have been left for Mu Xingjie if it had been Huang Wuji in Yi Zaiwen's place. Those people of the law enforcement hall had been clamoring initially, but Yi Zaiwen's stance had left them to feel unwell. In fact, they suddenly felt as if they had swallowed a housefly. Their complexions had turned very red. They had unceasingly spread the rumors in public that Yi Shiwen was a coward, that he was a person who would run away from a problem. And they were still at it even though Yi Shiwen had returned. They were simply looking down on him. They believed that Yi Shiwen was nothing more than an ant that had dared to challenge an elephant. They were in no rush to go look for trouble with Yi Shiwen. However, they hadn't expected that Yi Shiwen would turn the hand and give them a slap. Hadn't you all said that I'm a coward who refuses to face a problem and can't dare to act? Now, I'll show you. Moreover, this discoloration of the world is my way of picking a fight with Mu Xingjie. I've picked a fight with you. What of it? Most people used to consider Mu Xingjie as one of the top candidates for the position of the next university head because of his dreadful strength and illustrious reputation. Even those old monsters who had been staying hidden inside the true martial university for many years didn't dare to challenge him. So, it was needless to talk about the disciples of his generation. However, Yi Shiwen had dared to do so. And it was a big slap on the face of the law enforcement hall. Don't you want to cultivate? It'll make it difficult for you. It could be said that the experts who joined the true martial university didn't depend too much on the spirit energies present in the environment for their cultivation. After all, the speed of absorbing spirit energies from the atmosphere was extremely slow to meet their requirements. So, they would often use spirit stones or spirit dawn for their cultivation. In fact, absorbing the spirit energies of the world was just as an auxiliary method for them. The spiritual arteries of every peak were locked by all kinds of matrix formations and wouldn't be affected by the absorption of spirit energies. This was why Mu Xingjie had been absorbing the spirit energies of the surroundings so unscrupulously. Otherwise, he would have to retreat while facing the protest of the surging masses no matter how powerful he was. After all, he couldn't face all the experts of the university alone. However, everyone knew that Yi Shiwen had targeted Mu Xingjie. He might not have been able to cause a huge impact on him. However, it was a challenging stance nonetheless. I've picked a fight with you. What of it? Those disciples of the law enforcement hall became aghast after they came to know of Yi Zaiwen's intentions, as if they had eaten a dead rat. They began to clamor. Yi Shiwen had dared to make so much noise. This simply meant that he had looked down on their law enforcement hall. He had thrown a tight slap on their faces. Consequently, a lot of them had begun to shout that they should destroy the Hidden Star Peak as well as this ignorant guy. What do you mean by destroy the Hidden Star Peak? Is Hidden Star Peak a foreign enemy? It's unreasonable. Get lost from here. Perhaps, a group of enraged disciples of law enforcement hall would have already attacked the Hidden Star Peak if an authority figure of the law enforcement hall hadn't said this. However, one would be gravely mistaken if they thought that this authority figure of the law enforcement hall was biased in favor of Yi Shiwen. Let's presume that true martial university were a country with its left wing and right wing. Then, these people of the law enforcement hall would be the members of the right wing. In fact, they would belong to the extreme right wing. They were the followers of right-wing radical ideology through and through. The enmity between Yi Shiwen and law enforcement hall went a long way back. So, how could they let him off so easily? The appointment that has been pending for a decade must be finished now that he has returned. The strong voice of an old man immediately covered the entire true Martial Mountain range. The disciples of the true Martial University became excited as a result. Is the battle about to start? They had waited for more than a decade for this fight. It should be mentioned that they had already waited enough. But that wait was finally over now. Now, they were waiting for a reply from the Hidden Star Peak side. Huang Wuji had once caused chaos in the entire war-dead Star Peak. And that had made everyone have a whole new level of respect for the strength and background of the hidden Star Peak. They had realized that it wasn't a good idea to mess with anyone from the hidden Star Peak even if this peak didn't have too many people. I'm extremely delighted. I didn't like to see Mu Shungjie's arrogant and despotic appearance. Young brother, you did well. You've boldly given him a tight slap. They won't act arrogantly anymore. Bai Jiansong burst into laughter inside Hidden Star Peak's main hall. He was extremely carefree. There was a big enmity between the people of the Hidden Star Peak and the law enforcement hall because of Big Brother Huang Wuji. Bai Jiansong had been attacked many times by the people of Law Enforcement Hall when he had just entered True Martial University and joined the Hidden Star Peak. And this had happened precisely because of Huang Wuji. Therefore, Bai Jiansong didn't have a good opinion regarding these people who were in charge of managing everything. Basically, conflicts would break out between the two sides from time to time. Bai Jiansong's strength had become even more tyrannical after he had entered Great Sage Realm. He had now obtained a very high position in the True Martial University. Therefore, he had become even more dismissive towards Law Enforcement Hall's people. Third brother is right. Younger brother has thrown a slap on their faces with his method. Yang Wenjun was beside them. He also laughed out. He had also received a lot of trouble from Law Enforcement Hall's disciples in all the years of his stay at the Hidden Star Peak. It was just that he and Deng Shui Xan weren't as powerful as Huang Wuji. So, they could dare to resist the Law Enforcement Hall. They also didn't have incredible innate talent like Bai Jiansong. And they couldn't even be compared to a monster like Yi Shiwen. They all had suffered many hidden losses at the hands of the Law Enforcement Hall over the years. Therefore, no one on the Hidden Star Peak had disagreed when Yi Shiwen had said that he wanted to pull this off. Hidden Star Peak indeed had only a few people. In fact, counting them as a few would also be an overstatement. Our younger brother is indeed not a human. He has always been a monster. Deng Shui Xian said. Yan Wenjun, who was sitting next to her, was also nodding. It seemed as if he totally agreed with her. However, Yi Shiwen had become depressed. Is this a compliment? It sounds like abusing to me. Congratulations, younger brother. The Great Sage Realm is almost within your reach. Bai Jiansong suddenly said after he shot a glance at Yi Shiwen. What kind of genius haven't I seen in my entire life? Heaven's pride experts are nothing in my eyes. However, I've never seen a ferocious person like younger brother. Younger brother has already effortlessly crossed the mountain that ordinary people find very hard to cross. Great Sage Realm is just a matter of time for him now. It seems that our Hidden Star Peak will have another Great Sage expert in less than 100 years. Yi Shiwen certainly understood what Bai Jiansong was saying. What he had meant was obvious. Yi Ziwen's soul had already completely transformed and had become comparable to that of a great sage. This was the first step for the ambitious people who wanted to reach to the Great Sage Realm. However, it was also the most difficult one. Great Sage Realm would be just a matter of time after one had crossed this step. Bai Jiansong had been stuck in this step for 50 years before he had completed the transformation of his soul. This could already be regarded as an incomparably fast speed. However, Yi Shiwen had taken much lesser time to cross this step. So, how could this thing not have amazed Bai Jiansong? Chapter 590. Chapter 590. If anyone dares to come, then I will slap them to effortless? Yi Shiwen smiled wryly. It might look so in terms of the time since he had entered the Sage Realm within such a short span of 10 years. Moreover, he had crossed the toughest threshold for entering the Great Sage Realm, which was like a natural moat in many experts' opinion. This was truly a miracle. Therefore, calling it effortless wasn't too much. However, he had to put a great effort for 3 years in order to cross the step. He had to walk under that dreadful coercion for 3 years. An ordinary person would have collapsed under such a condition. Yi Shiwen also felt that he was abnormal to some extent. However, it wasn't because he possessed the so-called abnormal talent. Instead, it was because of his power to endure. Even Yi Mo had finally said that he hadn't anticipated that Yi Shiwen would persist till the end. He had believed that Yi Ziwen's willpower would have been considered as exceptional even if he had continued only till half of the way. However, Yi Shiwen had completed the entire distance. He was simply a super abnormal person in that regard. However, Yi Shiwen had almost lost his consciousness back then. He had almost been acting on his instincts as he had walked forward gradually. In fact, Yi Shiwen himself hadn't anticipated this result. He still felt somewhat proud of himself as he thought about this. He had come all this way till here. But it wasn't only because he possessed the mysterious space. It was also because he himself had outstanding willpower and perseverance. On the other side, Yang Wenjun and Deng Shuai-Xen felt confused when they heard this. It could be said that the barrier between Sage Realm and Great Sage Realm was still too far away for them. They had progressed only till the intermediate stage of Sage Realm in these 10 years. However, their speed would be considered as extremely quick even if they managed to reach till the threshold to Great Sage Realm in several hundred years. In fact, it depends on a person's opportunities whether they can enter the Great Sage Realm or not. The cultivation of the people apart from monsters like Yi Shiwen would take its sweet time to progress. They would slowly gain experience as their cultivation progressed with time. In other words, their cultivation was linked with time. Therefore, it was impossible for them to advance by leaps and bounds like Yi Shiwen could. It didn't matter how excellent a person's aptitude was in the beginning. It would wear down thoroughly after long-term cultivation. Yang Wenjun and Deng Shuai-Xen were also super talents in ordinary people's eyes. However, their talents had whittled down over the period of time in which they had cultivated till Sage Realm. And their remaining talent would also wear out with time. However, Bai Jiansong was much stronger than them on the other hand. So, he had quickly cultivated till Great Sage Realm, and was still progressing. The current cultivations of Yang Wenjun and Deng Shuai-Xen were far behind that of Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen, who was just at the Sage Small Perfection realm, hadn't deliberately restrained his cultivation. However, these two still couldn't see through the real depth of his cultivation. However, they also knew that Bai Jiansong wouldn't casually crack a joke. And this meant that Bai Jiansong must have been sure that Yi Shiwen had crossed the most difficult step of soul transformation if he had said so. So, they looked at Yi Shiwen one after another with shocked expressions. Their younger brother had disappeared for 10 years, and they couldn't even see through his cultivation now that he had returned. This had already left them in great shock. However, Yi Ziwen's cultivation seemed to be far greater than what they had previously estimated now when they heard Bai Jiansong's remark. This naturally made them incomparably amazed. It's just the beginning. I'll be lucky if I can enter the Great Sage Realm in 100 years, Yi Shiwen shook his head and said. He didn't take Bai Jiansong too seriously. This was because he clearly knew that it was extremely difficult to enter the Great Sage Realm. After all, even an exceptionally talented person like Bai Jiansong had taken 100 years to reach the Great Sage Realm. And this was just the time taken to advance to the Great Sage Realm from the late stage of half-step Great Sage Realm. Therefore, even Bai Jiansong wouldn't dare to say that the Great Sage Realm was easily achievable no matter how conceited he might be. However, he had still said that the Great Sage Realm was just a matter of time for Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen thought that Bai Jiansong was being modest. However, Yang Wenjun and Deng Shuai-Xen still felt that Yi Shiwen was abnormal when they heard Bai Jiansong's words. And how would these two feel if Yi Shiwen entered the Great Sage Realm in 100 years? After all, the two had been at the legendary realm at Yi Ziwen's current age. Therefore, they could only get secretly depressed. A group of abnormal people have gathered on the hidden star peak. And each one is more abnormal than the other. This made them feel so petty that they didn't know how to bear it. 100 years. Younger brother, you'll definitely break the record of our hidden star peak. Deng Shuai-Xen said, how had I not seen that you're such an abnormal person when you had joined us? All of you are a bunch of abnormal people. People like me and Brother Yang simply don't stand a chance in front of you. You're talking like that about your fellow brothers? Bai Jiansong laughed and scolded. He found it both funny and extremely embarrassing. He didn't know whether he should get angry or laugh. Deng Shuai-Xen giggled and stuck out her small tongue. Her smiling face blossomed just like a flower. Yang Wenjun had looked expressionless at first on the other hand. But his eyes filled with tenderness when he looked at Deng Shui exit. Yi Shiwen and Bai Jiansong looked at each other and laughed. After all, they knew that she wasn't truly mocking them. These two were soon going to get married. However, the people of Law Enforcement Hall won't leave this matter since younger brother has given them a tight slap on their faces. Yang Wenjun was somewhat worried. Yi Ziwen's move had vented their pent-up anger to some extent. However, the people of the Law Enforcement Hall were completely offended now. What are you afraid of? Well, slap them to death if they dare to fight us. Bai Jiansong coldly snorted. He looked the most energetic among them. The fact was that Bai Jiansong's full cooperation had played a big role when Yi Shiwen had activated the matrix formations of the Hidden Star Peak. Bai Jiansong wasn't as intense as Huang Wuji. However, his personality was almost the same. He was also an unruly lord. Brother Bai is right. I'll slap to death whosoever dares to come. Yi Shiwen grinned and revealed his white teeth. There was a sparkling smile on his face. Younger brother, it's not that I'm not optimistic about you, but that Chao Yuyu had already entered half-step Great Sage realm a few years ago. I'm afraid that he must have entered the intermediate stage of half-step Great Sage realm by now. Younger brother, you're definitely powerful. However, your cultivation time has been much shorter than his. Yang Wenjun looked deeply worried as he said. Younger brother doesn't seem to be worried for himself. So, what are you worried for? Don't you know that monsters can't be judged by ordinary people's standards? Bai Jiansong grinned and replied. His face exposed a carefree expression. It seemed as if he didn't care about Law Enforcement Hall's threat. He had become carefree about many matters after he had entered Great Sage Realm. And the Law Enforcement Hall was also far less important for him now. Yi Shiwen and Bai Jiansong were talking and laughing. Meanwhile, all the matrix formations of the entire Hidden Star Peak had become fully operational. And their might was getting bigger and bigger. They were majestically stirring up the clouds in the sky and thoroughly suppressing Mu Xingjie's limelight. Numerous disciples had been left in shock. Some old and senior experts had been undergoing closed-door training inside various microcosms in the depths of the true martial mountains. They also swept out their divine senses one after another. They wanted to find out what was going on here. They wanted to know why an inheritance had completely activated all of its matrix formations. Has the Hidden Star Peak gone insane? Do they want to pick a fight with the Law Enforcement Hall? Hidden Star Peak never disappoints when it comes to taking things too far. They've seen several generations when they manage to recruit only one disciple. However, everyone who joins them is incredible. Every single one of them is an unruly lord. So, what's strange in the fact that they've challenged the people of the Law Enforcement Hall? The juniors these days are much more aggressive than they used to be. The fight between Huang Wuji and Mu Xingjie had continued for countless years back in the day. It had caused a huge panic in the entire university. I hadn't expected that this enmity would continue forever. Sigh. The situation inside the university will become unstable once the storm arrives. I will bring many disasters along with it. The old monsters communicated with their divine senses in the void from inside various microcosms. Each one of them assessed the situation. Suddenly, a figure came flying from the void while everyone was talking about this unstable situation. And the void broke down into pieces wherever it went. This figure looked grandiose as it arrived above the Hidden Star Peak. Yi Shiwen, I've come for the appointment. Come out and die. It was an around 27 or 28-year-old man. He was dressed up in white robe. His figure looked tall and slim, and it seemed as if his face had been carved with a knife. His handsome face seemed to be smeared with frost, and was brimming with killing intention. It was Chao Yuyu. Nobody had seen him in the last 10 years. However, his aura had become even more formidable when compared to a decade ago. There was simply a difference of heaven and earth between his present and past auras. In fact, it seemed as if he had attained a qualitative change which had transformed his soul. His voice echoed in the sky like the sound of a big bell. It set off spirit energies which surged about and swept out swirling in the air. The defensive matrix formations of the entire hidden star peak responded. And the tyrannical auras of these matrix formations suddenly surged up from the hidden star peak. Several experts thought that the entire hidden star peak had become like a huge hedgehog at this moment. There was danger everywhere. Qiao Yuyu was seething in midair. A pair of iron hands would grasp the air from time to time and make it explode while issuing loud crackling sounds. His hands appeared as white as jade. The spirit energies were twining and circulating inside his hands. It appeared very bizarre. The entire true martial university was stirred up by this. The people had been waiting for this decisive battle for over 10 years. They had been waiting for this collision between two exceptional top-tier Heaven's Pride experts since the time when Qiao Yuyu had issued the declaration of war to Yi Shiwen a decade ago. They hadn't arrived in the true martial university at the same time. However, both of them were top-tier Heaven's Pride experts of their respective generations. So, the people were bound to be excited since this collision was finally about to take place. It could be said that not many people would have cared if Mu Xingjie had said that he would kill Yi Shiwen. However, this wasn't because Mu Xingjie didn't have prestige. Instead, it was because had too much prestige. After all, there was no way the people would be optimistic about Yi Ziwen's chances in a fight against Mu Xingjie if they weren't optimistic that Yi Shiwen could last in his fight with Qiao Yuyu. In fact, they weren't even thinking about this matter. They had thoroughly forgotten it. Everyone couldn't help but be worried when they saw Qiao Yuyu's hardly concealed and frightening aura of initial stage of half-step Great Sage Realm. However, they believed in fairness. And Yi Ziwen's current cultivation had made him as tyrannical in everyone's eyes as Qiao Yuyu was. But this was so because they were comparing Yi Ziwen's present cultivation with that of the one he had possessed 10 years ago. However, they would have to wait and see whether the two could even be compared or not. In fact, most people would be worried about Yi Shiwen if he was to be compared with the present Qiao Yuyu. Humph! A cold snort came from the depths of the hidden star peak. And a cyan figure came out flying along with it. It was a handsome youth dressed in cyan clothes. He straight off rushed towards Qiao Yuyu and arrived in front of him. His stunning imposing aura intertwined with an energy pillar and soared to the sky. His eyes looked as profound as the stars as he coldly stared at Qiao Yuyu. Chapter 591. Qiao Yuyu looked indifferent from his facial expression. He said, "Your cultivation has reached to Sage Small Perfection realm within a decade. Your innate talent is pretty good. However, everything ends here for you. You may have survived earlier. However, you'll die now." Qiao Yuyu wasn't surprised to see that Yi Shiwen had quickly made the breakthrough into Sage Small Perfection realm. However, it didn't matter how fast the cultivation speed of the so-called geniuses was in the beginning. After all, it would start to wear down after they entered the Sage realm. And their chances of entering the Great Sage realm in the future would also become fewer as a result. Let's presume that a Heaven's Pride expert reached to the Sage realm at a flying speed and still maintained extremely fast cultivation speed. However, it would gradually wear out and become sluggish as they approached the Great Sage realm. So, only a small portion of people who maintained extremely fast cultivation speed all the way up to the Great Sage realm could be considered as promising for making the breakthrough into Great Sage realm. Therefore, the true martial university used to prefer Heaven's Pride experts that had cultivated till half-step legendary's Great Complete realm. After all, such individuals were above everyone else. And this meant that their accomplishments would be limitless. However, he didn't know that Yi Shiwen was different from those Heaven's Pride level experts that relied upon the innate talent which had been bestowed upon them by the heavens. After all, Yi Shiwen had never cultivated depending upon his talent. Otherwise, he would have been stuck in the truth realm till now as per his talent. Therefore, the effects of the time restriction weren't as obvious on Yi Shiwen as they were on his peers. "Kill me." Yi Shiwen grinned. He was smiling in a carefree manner. In fact, it seemed that the two men were casually chit-chatting. "Who the hell do you think you are? Who the hell do you think you are?" Many people held their breaths as they heard this remark. Qiao Yuyu didn't possess tyrannical strength like Mu Xingjie. However, he also had an outstanding reputation among core disciples. So, he would certainly enter the great sage realm and become a mainstay of the university as long as he didn't come across any accident in the future. Perhaps, Yi Shiwen was the first one to have dared to say to him, "Who do you think you are?" Qiao Yuyu's expression became as cold as ice. A dreadful real elemental energy began to boil on his body. It even set off endless clouds. He couldn't wait anymore. After all, he had already waited for a decade. There wouldn't have been any problem if Yi Shiwen hadn't ever returned after escaping. However, it was the time of his death now that he had returned. The crane's cry shakes the whole world and stirs up 30 million stars. Qiao Yuyu suddenly brandished his hands. However, his hands were concealing claws in reality. The sound of a crane's cries suddenly resounded through the world. His jade-like transparent and pure white hands seemed to have transformed into a pair of incomparably sharp crane clutches. The space immediately got grabbed and exploded in his clutches. Yi Ziwen's eyelids jumped as he noticed something. This was Control Crane's 7 divine hands. He had seen Do Hexing use this technique. He had also seen Mu Xingjie's Wisp of Soul using it. It was an exceptional and incomparably powerful technique. Qiao Yuyu's Control Crane's 7 divine hands had reached a much higher degree of proficiency as compared to the one that Do Hexing had displayed. A majestic force rushed out, and endless spirit energies got absorbed by it. It transformed into a huge hand after absorbing this massive amount of energy, and crashed down. Countless disciples of the true martial university were watching this from afar. However, their complexions changed significantly as they saw countless spirit energies being grabbed and absorbed by this huge hand. The most dreadful thing was that they felt as if the principles in the surroundings were being distorted and ruptured by this huge hand. This was a very dreadful thing. And it wasn't merely because the Control Crane's 7 divine hands was incomparably miraculous. In fact, Qiao Yuyu's strength was also extremely tyrannical. Yi Shiwen felt as if endless murderous aura had locked him as this huge hand swooped down to grasp him. He felt as if he couldn't escape anywhere. In fact, the influence of concentrated energy had even locked the surrounding space. Humph! Yi Shiwen coldly snorted. His palm congealed into a fist, and his entire body emitted out a huge universe. It seemed as if the surroundings had transformed into a calm universe in an instant, and Yi Shiwen was standing inside it just like a true god. He was standing motionless while facing Qiao Yuyu's offense. Suddenly, a number of explosions occurred. Then they burst out starlight. Every wisp of this starlight smashed down towards Qiao Yuyu, as if coming straight from the explosion of a big star. Bang! The attacks of the two sides collided and shattered the space. In fact, the entire space had split open. Countless people were left dumbstruck when they saw this scene. Both men were just too terrifying. Everyone was already familiar with Qiao Yuyu's strength. After all, he had become famous many years ago. He had entered the true martial university many years ago, long before Yi Shiwen. Moreover, he had followed Mu Xingjie in an expedition for many years. So, he was famous both inside and outside the university. On the other hand, Yi Shiwen had never stayed silent since the time he had entered the true martial university. He had unceasingly made noise in all kinds of matters from the very beginning. Everyone believed that he was the biggest troublemaker. There was no one among the disciples of this generation who could rival him in this regard. This obviously wasn't a good evaluation of him. However, these people at least believed that Yi Shiwen couldn't be taken lightly. However, it was merely that he couldn't be taken lightly, and nothing more. No one truly believed that he could be a match for Qiao Yuyu. After all, there was a huge difference in age between the two sides. However, nobody had anticipated the fight would progress like this. Yi Shiwen and Qiao Yuyu had turned out to be evenly matched in the fight. This had turned into a fierce battle between two evenly matched opponents. Both individuals were outstanding geniuses of their respective generations. Everyone was thinking what kind of fortuitous encounter Yi Shiwen had had in the last 10 years that he had advanced by leaps and bounds within such a short time. After all, he had promoted by one entire realm. He used to be at semi-sage realm expert back then. However, he was giving a challenge to an expert of half-step great sage realm now. Qiao Yuyu looked at Yi Shiwen in disbelief. There was a look of astonishment in his eyes. He still remembered how Yi Ziwen's situation used to be 10 years ago. It had been very strenuous for Yi Shiwen to even withstand his war declaration back then. However, he had calmly faced his move at this time, as if it was nothing. What kind of a fortuitous encounter has he had in these past 10 years? Qiao Yuyu wasn't the only one to have felt this. Even those disciples who were watching this fight from afar felt so. Qiao Yuyu has cultivated the control crane's 7 divine hands to an extremely incredible degree. Moreover, he hasn't practiced an incomplete version of this technique like Do Hexing. It is said that Mu Xingjie thinks highly of Qiao Yuyu. That's why he hasn't held back this technique control crane's 7 divine hands. He has taught this technique to Qiao Yuyu without any reservations. Yi Shiwen is also unfathomably ferocious. He has cultivated Big Bang Stardust Fist. It must be mentioned that this technique had become extinct a long time ago. Moreover, this set of fist technique was invincible in the past. It is not clear how many people have been killed by this technique. However, it had become extinct long ago. So, nobody could comprehend this set of fist technique for a long time. I hadn't expected that this technique would re-exhibit its former glory in his hands. The shadows of 2 figures were standing on a peak in some microcosm in the void consisting of layer up layer of overlapping subspaces. Their laser-like gazes pierced through the spatial layers and fell onto the battlefield of Yi Shiwen and Qiao Yuyu. One of them had a childlike face. He was dressed in black clothes. There was a symbol on his chest. He was in fact a high-ranking elder of Law Enforcement Hall. A woman was standing beside him. She wore a red dress. She had delicate facial features. However, her vision had turned ice-cold upon looking at Yi Shiwen. Her beautiful face had turned as cold as frost. A person would cry out in surprise if he saw her appearance at this time. This was the newly appointed Deputy Lord of Law Enforcement Hall, Zhao Fiji. Yi Shiwen must had a fortuitous encounter. He was like an ant a decade ago. He hadn't even reached Sage Realm. However, he's competing on equal terms with Qiao Yuyu now. It's truly unimaginable. The black-clothed elder of Law Enforcement Hall opened his mouth and said, "This is the so-called impermanence of the world. Qiao Yuyu is my right hand. I've specially trained him. He'll become the Deputy Lord in the future, and he'll assist me after you old fogies retire." Zhao Fiji replied. She had addressed the black-clothed elder beside her as Old Fogey. However, he didn't feel a bit embarrassed. He was perhaps accustomed to Zhao Fiji's ice-cold and straightforward way of talking. "Yeah. It will be the time for you young people to lead soon after we old guys retire. However, we are unfortunately in such a precarious situation at the moment." The black-clothed elder replied. "What precarious situation? The university will certainly rise to supreme glory once again as long as Brother Mu Xingjie is present in the Law Enforcement Hall. All the traitors will be executed. We'll start an expedition against all the traitors. We must eradicate all unstable elements in order to achieve this goal." Zhao Fiji said as an ice-cold and ruthless look flashed in her eyes. There was also a trace of fanaticism in her eyes. "This Aunt Yi Shiwen has already caused enough trouble for us. Moreover, every member of the Hidden Star Peak is a potentially unstable element. The same can be said for their leader Huang Wuji. However, I can say for sure that the university would return to its past glory under Brother Mu's leadership." A fanatical look appeared in the eyes of the black-clothed elder as well after Zhao Fiji's speech. Let's presume that the true martial university was a country. Then, these disciples of the Law Enforcement Hall were the members of Right Wing. In fact, they belonged to the extreme right wing. These could be considered as the members of the hardcore extremists through and through. They believed in the rule of the iron fist. They used to treat anyone that didn't agree with them as unstable elements. And they must eradicate those unstable elements as per their extreme ideology. A cruel, smiling expression appeared in Zhao Fiji's eyes as she looked at Yi Shiwen. Her beautiful face looked rather sinister at the moment. A great sage expert like her believed that Yi Shiwen was just like an ant as long as he hadn't entered the great sage realm. What was the use of having just talent? After all, there were many geniuses in this world, but most of them couldn't reach the final stage. Geniuses also need luck to reach to great sage realm. However, it was impossible for her to personally attack Yi Shiwen as per her status. Moreover, the hidden star peak had Huang Wuji, and he was a powerhouse who could compete with Mu Xingjie. Therefore, even she was afraid of the consequences that they would have to face if she attacked Yi Shiwen without sufficient grounds for doing so. However, this boy is sly and crafty. I'm afraid that some mishap may take place. The black-clothed elder said. But don't you have confidence in Qiao Yuyu? Zhao Fiji asked. That's not what I meant. It's just that this boy never engages in a fight without complete assurance of winning it. The fact that our law enforcement hall has unceasingly suffered losses at his hands isn't without any reason. He resembles from many years ago. Huang Wuji. Meanwhile, the fight between Yi Shiwen and Qiao Yu hadn't stopped after the initial confrontation. On the contrary, it had become even more intense. Qiao Yuyu had also realized that Yi Shiwen wasn't ordinary after Yi Ziwen's first attack. Instead, his strength far exceeded Sage Small Perfection Realm. Chapter 592. What kind of a magical power has he practiced? Qiao Yuyu, you seem very eager to lose. So, it'll help you in accomplishing your aim. Yi Shiwen said in a calm voice. Then, the golden divinities suddenly crawled over his entire body, and his vitality surged out. He looked like a golden god of war from afar. Unleashing the divinities was a signal from Yi Shiwen, and this meant that he was going to fight with his entire strength. This proved that Qiao Yuyu was a formidable opponent in his opinion. Otherwise, an ordinary person would have been killed by him in a slap by now. He wouldn't have gotten a chance to clamor with him. Lose? Do you think that you've become qualified to speak like this after stopping just one of my moves? Qiao Yuyu coldly replied. It seemed that he already had a well-thought-out plan. Therefore, he was looking at Yi Shiwen with a condescending expression in his eyes. His imposing aura looked stunning. After all, he had already entered the half-step Great Sage Realm. He was merely at the initial stage of half-step Great Sage Realm. However, it touched the two words Great Sage. So, he was on a whole another level than Sage Realm. He very clearly knew about Yi Ziwen's situation. He knew that Yi Ziwen's body was extremely formidable. The owner of Titan Body had once lost at his hands. In fact, that tremendous power had swept away everything just like the mighty waves in this fight had done a moment ago. So, Qiao Yuyu already knew that Yi Shiwen possessed an extremely powerful body. Even a Heaven's Pride expert of half-step Great Sage Realm like him couldn't obtain a slight advantage in front of Yi Shiwen. However, Yi Shiwen only had a formidable body and nothing more. But, Qiao Yuyu's realm was much higher than that of Yi Shiwen. Therefore, Qiao Yuyu didn't believe that his own body would be much inferior to that of a Sage Small Perfection level expert like Yi Shiwen. After all, there was a huge disparity between their realms. Yi Shiwen is gravely mistaken if he thinks that he is entitled to clamor in front of me after stopping just one of my moves. Do you want to try and find out whether I'm qualified or not? Yi Shiwen let out a sneer from the corner of his mouth. Yi Ziwen's fist didn't hesitate even a bit. It was immediately brandished just like the planets move in their trajectory. The fist pressure crushed the dome of the heaven. It then transformed into a big star and smashed down towards Qiao Yuyu. The chaos almost surged out wherever it went. This scene seemed like the rebirth of the world. Yi Shiwen looked even more godlike after he attacked with his entire strength and unleashed his divinities. It wasn't known when his body had transformed into a boundless star field. His face looked expressionless as he stood in the center of the universe. The fiercely burning big stars fell off the sky and pounded on the vast land just like meteors. Incomparably huge holes had been cut open on the ground. There were screams and mourns everywhere on it. It looked like the scene of doomsday. This was the complete demonstration of the fist intention of Big Bang Stardust Fist. It was said that the founder of the Big Bang Stardust Fist had once seen the complete destruction of a planet in a meteor shower. All kinds of forces looked tiny and frail in front of the mighty force of this universe. The sound of the cry of a crane sounded above this vast land. A big hand suddenly grasped out in the sky. And it seemed as if those falling meteors would immediately get caught by this hand. However, a crane-type ominous beast immediately came out from all the concentrated chaos and thundered in the world. People heard the roar of that ominous beast even amidst all this noise and commotion. It was a kind of invincible ominous beast. It trod through the chaos and skyrocketed for 90,000 miles in just one stride. The two sides didn't hold back even a bit. They must kill the opposite party immediately. Their four big hands exuded incredible divine beams and collided with each other. Yi Ziwen's fist transformed into a big star. It dodged that stunning claw and smashed on the body of that crane-type ominous beast. Bang! A huge mushroom cloud rose from the back of the crane-type ominous beast. The dreadful impact almost didn't make the entire crane-type ominous beast completely disintegrate on the spot. Bang! Another collision took place. Both men didn't stop even a bit, and again launched an attack towards each other. The entire sky immediately got permeated with incomparably dazzling lights that blocked the sunlight. Everyone had imagined that Chao Yuyu would completely overpower Yi Shiwen. However, it didn't happen. On the contrary, Yi Shiwen had dramatically resisted Chao Yuyu. He hadn't fallen into a disadvantageous situation. And this was completely beyond everyone's imagination. Is this all you've got? Let me send you to hell in that case. Chao Yuyu and Yi Shiwen had exchanged several hundred blows in an instant. They had already resorted to extreme methods. So, Chao Yuyu no longer had the high and mighty ice-cold attitude like before. But he must vent his soaring rage on Yi Shiwen. A pair of snow-white wings immediately appeared behind Chao Yuyu after he finished speaking. It seemed as if his wings had been condensed from countless spirit energies, and the principle of wind was integrated into them. His figure suddenly flashed, and an afterimage appeared in its place. Chao Yuyu's words hadn't even faded when a jade-like pure white palm appeared in front of Yi Shiwen. It was coming towards Yi Ziwen's throat to clutch it. Fast, fast, fast. Its speed was incredibly fast. It seemed as if it had instantly arrived in front of Yi Ziwen's neck, just like a white lightning. It would be a dead end for Yi Shiwen if this hand clutched his neck. After all, he would be choked to death. This attack happened so fast that no one could track it. Yi Shiwen saw that Chao Yuyu's figure had already arrived in front of him the next moment. And his afterimage was still present at a distant place. It was clear how fast his speed was. Yi Shiwen couldn't help but be shocked. He hadn't expected that Chao Yuyu had a hidden trump card. Such speed was incomparably terrifying. He had rushed over almost instantly. The agility skill inherent to the Control Crane 7 Divine Hand, or the wind attribute of that agility skill to be precise, had increased his speed to the acme. His speed had increased by several times almost instantly. He was at the half-step Great Sage realm. Therefore, he had used a bit of space principle in coordination with the wind attribute of the inherent agility skill of his Control Crane 7 Divine Hands. Consequently, his speed had become so fast that he couldn't be tracked by the human eye. Bang! A bit of elated expression appeared in the eyes of Chao Yuyu as he grabbed Yi Ziwen's neck. Finally, I can get rid of this abominable guy. What's the use of having an intrepid body if you can't catch up with my speed? I can crush you to death now. Bang! Chao bang! Chao Yuyu pinched with his entire strength. And Yi Shiwen shattered like a mirror image before his eyes. However, the elated expression on his face froze at this moment. He was greatly astonished in his heart. I couldn't catch Yi Shiwen. Nobody had ever matched his speed since the time he had practiced this pair of crane wings. His strength had undergone a tremendous change because of it. Perhaps he would have killed his opponent without blinking his eyes if an expert of half-step Great Sage realm were standing in front of him. In fact, it was impossible even for an expert of intermediate stage of half-step Great Sage realm to beat him. Because his speed was way too fast. After all, Speed was the way of survival in this so-called world of martial arts. He had the assistance of the extremely powerful control crane's 7 divine hands. So, he simply wouldn't come across any harm as long as his speed had reached to a certain degree. However, he couldn't catch Yi Shiwen. He had failed for the first time. This is bad. Chao Yuyu secretly said this is bad. Then he promptly turned around. Yi Ziwen's ice-cold voice came from behind him at this time. Is this your hidden trump card? Then, an incredible sword intention shrouded Chao Yuyu in an instant. It broke down Chao Yuyu's entire defenses just like lightning. Chao Yuyu unfolded his pair of wings at this crucial moment, transformed into a streamer of light, and dodged this killer blow. Bang! The entire mountain peak on which Chao Yuyu was standing got cut open into 2 halves by the sword intention. Everyone held their breath. They were left dumbstruck as they saw this scene. They were baffled. It took long to describe all this. However, all this had taken place in an instant. It had happened in just a split second. It was just like a flash of miracle for those experts who were watching this fight. The overbearing Chao Yuyu had been forced into a distressed situation within the blink of an eye. Many weak experts couldn't see what had finally happened between these 2 men. Only some powerful experts of half-step Great Sage realm and some Great Sage experts had clearly seen what had happened. They had held their breaths even more tightly since they had clearly witnessed everything. What kind of magical ability has Yi Shiwen practiced that his speed has become so fast? Chao Yuyu couldn't catch Yi Shiwen even with the help of the agility skill of Control Crane's 7 divine hands. A senior expert of half-step Great Sage realm said. Soon, everyone found out what had happened from each other. Therefore, they finally knew what had truly happened a moment ago. Don't you know this? Yi Shiwen has an invincible body. But his speed is also extremely fast. However, he very rarely needs to use such dreadful speed because of his overly tyrannical body. Some legendary experts proudly explained at this time. All of them belonged to Yi Ziwen's generation. Therefore, they naturally knew much more about him than the experts of half-step Great Sage realm and Great Sage realm. After all, these powerful experts had been undergoing closed-door training for many years. In fact, these experts of half-step Great Sage realm and Great Sage realm didn't even know that Yi Shiwen was a sage expert before the fight had begun. However, this was a very normal situation. The fact was that these Great Sage experts had a lifespan of several thousand years. So, they used to undergo closed-door training for several hundred years at a stretch. And several hundred years were enough for true martial university to welcome students of several sessions. So, these top experts believed that there was no point in remembering these newcomers. Therefore, it was very normal if they couldn't recognize a lot of people after coming out of the closed-door training. What kind of magical ability has he practiced? Why can't I see it? A Great Sage expert said impatiently. After all, how could these experts of legendary realm have acted presumptuously in front of them if these top experts knew about it? Those experts of legendary realms suddenly lost their voices as that Great Sage expert asked this question. Most of Yi Ziwen's magical abilities and martial art techniques were unorthodox. So, they didn't know from where he had inherited them. After all, there were so many heritages in this world. So, how could they possibly know what all magical abilities Yi Shiwen possessed? Those experts were in uproar because Yi Shiwen had displayed super speed. However, Yi Shiwen leisurely appeared in the sky shaking his head in disappointment. It is such a pity that my sword intention didn't kill Chao Yuyu just now. Chapter 593. You can't make plans together if your paths are D. The accuracy and speed of Yi Ziwen's last attack had deeply impressed those Great Sage experts who were watching the fight. Otherwise, they wouldn't have asked what kind of magical ability Yi Shiwen had practiced in such an anxious manner. One must know that each of them was an experienced and knowledgeable old monster. After all, they were Great Sage experts. It could even be said that the roads they had traveled so far were longer than the lifetime journey of many experts. They had even seen many ancient magical powers. However, they had failed to understand when it came to Yi Ziwen's magical ability. They couldn't see through the origins of Yi Zaiwen's current agility technique. However, they didn't know that Yi Zaiwen's devil wings ability would be regarded as an old magical power, but wouldn't be regarded as an ancient one, even in the devil world. It was an incredible ability which had been developed by the previous Devil King when he used to be famous back in the day. So, it wasn't something they could comprehend. Moreover, the devil wings had been changed beyond all recognition after Yi Shiwen had cultivated and transformed them for such a long time. Furthermore, he had unceasingly modified this technique so that it could be more compatible with his human form of cultivation methods. In fact, he had used his mysterious space to deduce all kinds of subtleties of the devil wings. He didn't want to transform into a person that was half human and half devil like those people of the devil worship cult. A half-human and half-devil body might not be a big concern for those experts who were extremely eager to attain greater power. However, Yi Shiwen wouldn't be able to stand it if he got transformed into a non-human freak. Chao Yuyu looked at Yi Shiwen with an incredulous expression. There was a complicated expression in his eyes at the moment. He had been just a bit careless a moment ago, and Yi Shiwen had taken advantage of it. Yi Shiwen had immediately launched a killing move, and nearly killed him in that instant. However, Chao Yuyu was also an experienced person. After all, he had followed Mu Shungjie on an expedition for many years. And it wasn't known how many battles of life or death he had experienced. Therefore, he was able to suppress his astonishment very quickly. Well, I wonder if I have the qualifications now, Yi Shiwen grinned and said. Chao Yuyu's complexion turned very ugly. Yi Shiwen had mocked him by repeating what he had said a moment ago, that Yi Shiwen didn't have enough qualifications. I was just a bit careless, that's all. Do you think you'd get another opportunity of this kind? Chao Yuyu replied. His figure suddenly disappeared as soon as he was finished speaking. Then, his divine power suddenly rushed out and arrived in front of Yi Shiwen the very next moment. He then unfolded the Control Crane's 7 divine hands, grabbed endless spirit energies, and overturned them upon Yi Shiwen. Crash bang! Countless golden divinities began to boil on Yi Zaiwen's body. They then surged out when the Control Crane's 7 divine hands were about to grab his body in order to kill him. After that, they condensed into a pair of golden wings, and shrouded Yi Shiwen completely. Bang! The Control Crane's 7 divine hands rumbled on top of the pair of wrapped golden wings, and produced a mushroom cloud. The dreadful shock waves swept out swirling in the air, and vibrated the surrounding space. The sound of explosion dissipated in all directions. Yi Zaiwen's devil wings had revealed their complete form. Those experts of half-step Great Sage and Great Sage realm opened their eyes wide to see Yi Zaiwen's devil wings. All of them tried to guess the origin of his devil wings. It's definitely the magical power of gods or devils. You can't break my magical power. Your Control Crane's 7 divine hands doesn't even come close. Yi Shiwen burst into laughter. The devil wings used to be the outstanding skill of the Devil King in the past. The Control Crane's 7 divine hands was also an outstanding technique. However, how could it be compared with the devil wings? Whoosh! Yi Zaiwen's devil wings transformed into a sea of endless thunder and lightning. The wind power and thunder power were boiling therein. The wind power and thunder power suddenly formed a wind hand and a thunder hand respectively. Then, the 2 big hands interlocked in the sky just like 2 dragons, and soared towards Chao Yuyu to grab him. Chao Yuyu had sharp eyes. So, he naturally knew how dreadful these wind and thunder powers were. Their destructiveness was enormous. There weren't many experts who would want to encounter these 2 powers at once. Pure white wings suddenly unfolded behind Chao Yuyu, and he disappeared into the void. However, the speed of wind and thunder powers that were chasing him also increased more and more, and they chased him to the depths of the void. Both wind element and thunder element were famous for their incomparably fast speed. Their speed didn't slow down under Yi Zaiwen's control, and they continued to chase Chao Yuyu. Yi Shiwen believed that Chao Yuyu didn't have any place to hide even if he had disappeared into the void. Yi Zaiwen's control over the wind and thunder powers had reached to a satisfactory degree after his cultivation of the devil wings had gone up by 1 level. He could now manipulate the wind and thunder powers to chase down Qiao Yuyu. Everyone hadn't been able to see the proceedings clearly at first since these two fighters were extremely fast. However, they were clearly seeing what Yi Shiwen was doing now. Consequently, they were left dumbstruck on the spot. After all, they hadn't expected that they would get to see such a scene. Qiao Yuyu was being chased by Yi Shiwen like a stray dog. He had fallen into a disadvantageous position after their first clash itself. He didn't even have the power to fight back in front of a junior expert like Yi Shiwen, whose realm was far inferior to his. Yi Shiwen had unexpectedly gained the upper hand. What the hell was happening in this world? Were they dreaming? Or had this world gone insane? It wasn't that they hadn't seen exceptions to these rules before. However, a sage small perfection level expert competing against an expert of initial stage of half-step great sage realm, and still gaining an upper hand was the kind of thing that probably only Yi Shiwen could pull off. Moreover, it wasn't some ordinary expert of the initial stage of half-step great sage realm. It was a Heaven's Pride expert. Qiao Yuyu had also been a famous Heaven's Pride expert some time ago. However, he was being chased like a dog right now. This world had become too crazy. Qiao Yuyu also felt that the big wind and thunder hands were getting increasingly close from behind. So, he bellowed in anger, "Yi Shiwen, do you think that I won't be able to deal with you because of this move of yours?" Boom! However, his angry roar got suppressed by the sounds of the dreadful explosions caused by those superposed big hands of wind and thunder. The wind and thunder powers instinctively caused destruction and collisions right after being unleashed by Yi Shiwen. It seemed for a time as if there was no other sound present in the entire world. Has Qiao Yuyu died? Someone couldn't help but blurt out. However, he had only said what the majority of the people were thinking after Qiao Yuyu had been patted by Yi Ziwen's two big hands. Has Qiao Yuyu died? The dust settled. Then, a human's shadow appeared before everyone's eyes whilst the destroyed void restored at a speed that was visible to the naked eye. Everyone was surprised to see that Qiao Yuyu was flapping his wings. Endless spirit energies had condensed into Dao talismans in order to form a huge shield in front of his body. Consequently, those explosions hadn't been able to approach his body. However, the resolute people also noted that Qiao Yuyu's complexion had clearly turned paler than before. It was obvious that the recent explosions had caused him some injuries. And he wasn't as relaxed as he was showing from outside. Unstable elements like you must be eradicated. The true martial university can restore to its former glory only after it has been united under Senior Brother Mu's leadership. Why can't you understand this? Why? Why do people of your kind always appear? Damn it. Qiao Yuyu's complexion turned sinister and fanatical. Then, it became cruel again. Yi Shiwen looked at Qiao Yuyu again. However, there wasn't an expression of disgust in his eyes anymore. These people must be loathed. However, they indeed had a lofty goal that Yi Shiwen couldn't hope to attain. After all, Yi Shiwen wasn't thinking about the true martial university's rejuvenation at present. And that's because this wasn't something that could be achieved by one person alone. After all, true martial university's emergence was accompanied by the sacrifices of countless ancestors and rains of blood. The road to its glory was paved with the bones of those who had sacrificed themselves. Similarly, the true martial university's decline was also accompanied by the deaths of countless ancestors who had been defeated in the war. Anyway, its rejuvenation wasn't something that could be achieved by a single person or a small group. After all, the situation of the rival forces like Xian Yuan Palace Hall had changed now, even though they used to tremble in horror under the true martial university at one point of time. They had become very strong now. In fact, they had become as huge a force as the true martial university. There was no need for the current Yi Shiwen to think about this matter as per his current strength. However, there was a chance that he might think about it in the future. But that was again a matter for the future. However, the look in Yi Ziwen's eyes turned even more determined. His killing intention didn't decrease. He won't do. He and I have different paths. We can't work together. They may have a great goal. But can it still conceal their hegemonic ideology of if not my friend then foe? That big traitor Wang Jingwei had defected to the enemy in the past life. And he didn't necessarily have the intention to use this method to preserve the nation. However, he was unable to conceal his traitorous nature. Moreover, Yi Shiwen didn't believe that Mu Xingjie was suitable to be the one to take a stand if there truly was a need for doing so. Even big brother Huang Wuji is more suitable than him. Besides, Yi Shiwen wasn't just an ordinary enemy of the law enforcement halls. After all, they had this if not my friend then foe classification method. In fact, he was their archenemy. Someone who must be eradicated. And he would remain a sworn enemy to them until he died. Therefore, Yi Shiwen had no other choice but to cut a bloody path out of the battlefield. Chao Yuyu seemed to have gone crazy. He incarnated a mountain-sized giant crane and stretched out its slender legs towards Yi Shiwen in order to crush him. This was like trampling the world. A powerful claw grabbed the chaos itself. It seemed as if it would reassemble the elements of earth, fire, water, and wind, and recreate the world. The huge claw rushed to grab Yi Shiwen, who was flying in the sky. Bang! That claw grabbed the devil wings that had wrapped Yi Shiwen with massive power. It seemed that it possessed infinite might as it shook Yi Zaiwen's devil wings. Countless spirit energies surged about crazily as a result. That claw couldn't shatter the devil wings' flawless defense. But it still managed to open up a gap in it. It had happened for a split second. However, even a split second could decide the outcome of a battle for these top experts. In fact, it could even decide the outcome of a military campaign. It's over. Yi Shiwen, you're finished. You're going to act as a stepping stone and witness senior brother Mu's glory. Chao Yuyu's face looked incomparably cruel. His figure suddenly disappeared. And he had already attacked Yi Shiwen from the front when his figure reappeared the next moment. Chapter 594, Demon Repellent Tablet. I hadn't expected Yi Shiwen to be so outstanding. He's a rarely seen evil genius. Zhao Fiji's vision turned ice-cold as she said, however, it's very unfortunate that people like him become unstable elements in the true martial university. Such people must be eradicated if they're of no use to us. Anyone who comes in the way of our grand plan must die. The black-clothed elder narrowed his eyes. The expression inside his eyes had become even colder. Meanwhile, everyone exclaimed in unison as they saw that Chao Yuyu had already attacked. His speed was extremely quick. His attack had arrived in front of Yi Shiwen almost in a split second. Yi Shiwen could feel the crazy vibrations happening in his devil wings. His golden divinities which had enveloped his wings vibrated even more, just like his body. Chao Yuyu's big hand pierced his body in that instant, and his entire person collapsed, like an afterimage. Chao Yuyu's complexion instantly changed when this happened. After all, he hadn't expected that he would fail to grab Yi Shiwen once again. He was sure that he had caught Yi Shiwen off guard this time. So, he couldn't have expected that he still wouldn't grab him. Your speed is slow. Yi Zaiwen's ice-cold voice came from behind Chao Yu. You can try as many times as you want. However, I'll be in vain. Then, Yi Shiwen shot his fire clouds falling sky hand. It blotted out the sky and covered the earth as it smashed down. He had already cultivated his fire clouds falling sky hand to a perfect condition. However, only genuine experts could tell that Yi Shiwen had perfected this technique. The strength of this attack was very terrifying. It seemed as if the clouds in the sky had burnt and fallen down onto the ground whilst crazily breaking the void. The expressions in everyone's eyes had changed. Each chunk of these burning clouds possessed the same might as the full-strength attack of an expert of the initial stage of half-step Great Sage Realm. Those experts of half-step Great Sage Realm might have the power to destroy one of such clouds. However, the massive attack range of so many clouds was simply overwhelming. They wouldn't be able to deal with it. It seemed as if the king of initial stage of half-step Great Sage Realm was disdainfully showing off his powers. Yi Zaiwen's hand gave off the feel of doomsday. It had suddenly shrouded the area in a radius of dozens of miles. Even the spirit energies that came in contact with it got exploded in an instant. It was an extremely dreadful scene. Yi Ziwen's martial power was shockingly profound. Nobody could have thought that he possessed such strength. They simply hadn't expected that they would be worried for Qiao Yuyu. After all, everyone had believed that this would be an entirely one-sided battle. However, their imaginations had been subverted after only the first confrontation. Qiao Yuyu reacted when the hand was about to grab and extinguish him. His speed was extremely quick. He flew away and streaked to the horizon just like a white lightning. Then, Qiao Yuyu suddenly turned around and assumed an awe-inspiring stance. He then suddenly gaped, and a long and blazing river surged out of his mouth. This river launched attacks in all directions. In fact, this burning river had sourced from the inexhaustible real elemental energies that were burning inside him. This vast ocean had condensed from Qiao Yuyu's real elemental energy, and it had started to pour down at this time. Everyone's facial expression spoke the same thing. Qiao Yuyu is going all out. Everyone felt ridiculous as they got to this conclusion. Shouldn't Yi Shiwen be the one going all out? How come Qiao Yuyu is going all out at this time? One was a Heaven's Pride expert of half-step Great Sage Realm, while the other was that of Sage Small Perfection Realm. There was a big contrast in power between the two. So, one could have told who was weak and who was strong without even looking at them. There had apparently been no need to draw a comparison since everyone had been certain about one person's chances. And that person had been Qiao Yuyu in the beginning. However, Qiao Yuyu was presently going all out in order to fight back against Yi Shiwen. Qiao Yuyu again shot his big hand after he had spouted the long river condensed from his real elemental energy. The endless river of real elemental energy got absorbed by the big hand. Then, that jade-like big hand smashed down in a flash to grab Yi Shiwen. Rumble! Everyone felt as if the world was swaying. A dreadful force had swept out from the collision between two terrifying attacks. The violent shock had distorted the space. The people that saw this became worried as they didn't know when it might suddenly collapse. Yi Ziwen's expression turned cold. He knew that Qiao Yuyu had attacked with his entire strength. Qiao Yuyu had been completely suppressed by Yi Shiwen in terms of strength. Therefore, it was obvious that he would go all out this time. It's truly a fierce strike. However, it's still not enough. Yi Shiwen realized that his own offensive had been instantly defeated, and the Control Crane's 7 divine hands was about to grab his body. He had already cultivated his gilded tyrant form to the 7th layer. So, the toughness of his body had reached to an unimaginable extent. His every move had the power to destroy the stars. It was exceptionally dreadful. Flutter! 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 Yi Shiwen stood unfazed in the face of the overwhelming Control Crane's 7 divine hands. His real elemental energy immediately surged out. It blew against his clothes and issued fluttering sounds. Simultaneously, it transformed into countless sword energies and emerged out from his body. The sword energies emitted from every pore of his body. In fact, Yi Shiwen looked like a huge porcupine since his entire body was protruding spikes. Bang! 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 Each bit of sword energy crashed onto the Control Crane's 7 divine hands and issued dreadful sounds of explosion. The Control Crane's 7 divine hands looked robust initially, but they were soon eliminated under the unexpected and violent raid of the numerous sword energies. Not much power was left in it after it had collided with Yi Ziwen's Fire Cloud's falling sky hand. Consequently, it suddenly collapsed at this time. The Control Crane's 7 divine hands that seemed to possess illustrious might a moment ago had already disappeared by now. Not a bit of it was left since it had been wiped out by Yi Ziwen's sword energies. Yi Shiwen strode out step by step. It seemed as if every step he took would shorten the sky. It seemed like he was shrinking a great distance into an inch. He had already arrived near Qiao Yuyu along with the golden light. He suddenly shot a punch, and the Big Bang Stardust fist swept out unhindered. Bang! It seemed as if Yi Ziwen's fist had broken the pillars that were supporting the heavens since the vast sky collapsed all of a sudden. Simultaneously, an incomparably dreadful rumbling sound reverberated. The Big Bang Stardust Fist was a fist technique that itself possessed ample amount of attacking power and murderous aura. It could nearly disintegrate the world. Chao Yuyu's advantage of speed had also disappeared in front of Yi Shiwen. In fact, it seemed as if Chao Yuyu didn't have any speed since he couldn't even think of displaying this formidable advantage in front of Yi Shiwen. Chao Yuyu's innate talent was considered outstanding in the entire world. Moreover, he had also obtained treasures over various adventures. However, Yi Shiwen had Yi Mo's assistance. Therefore, he had the assistance of an old monster which had followed the Devil King on expeditions for many years. And Yi Mo was the only one of his kind in the entire world. There was no one like him. Chao Yuyu's complexion had turned pale with fright since Yi Shiwen had unexpectedly and suddenly arrived in front of him. And this had obviously caught him off guard. Therefore, Chao Yuyu promptly retreated. He must go as far as he could from Yi Zaiwen's attack range. However, Yi Shiwen obviously wasn't going to allow his enemy to escape. He would never spare an enemy, nor would he allow them to make a comeback. So, he rushed forward and chased after Chao Yuyu. Yi Shiwen didn't delay in any respect, and didn't allow Chao Yuyu to escape. Anyone with discerning eyes could see that Chao Yuyu was hugely disadvantaged in terms of speed at this time. Chao Yuyu's strength could be regarded at the peak in his realm. And his speed was even faster. However, his speed looked nothing in front of Yi Zaiwen's, and he had completely fallen into a disadvantageous position. Chao Yuyu's speed had reached to the extreme. However, it could be said that it was fast, but not the fastest. Chao Yuyu had failed to overpower Yi Shiwen in other aspects after he had fallen into a disadvantageous position in this aspect. And that had led to the current situation. What kind of magical power is this? It's very hard to imagine that there is a martial arts technique that can surpass the agility skill of Control Crane's 7 Divine Hands. It is true that the agility skill of the Control Crane's 7 Divine Hands is merely an accessory skill. However, it's a top-tier agility skill. It is enough to be compared with the top-tier agility skills of our true martial university. In fact, it is above them in all aspects. Otherwise, Mu Shengjie wouldn't have majored in this technique. However, it has repeatedly failed in front of a sage small perfection level expert like Yi Shiwen. This is truly unbelievable. Someone said this whilst sighing with emotion. This was also what the majority of people were thinking at this moment. It felt way too terrifying. It seemed as if Yi Zaiwen's speed had no upper limit. It could be said that the more Chao Yuyu's speed increased, the more his opponent's speed increased as well. Yi Shiwen had constantly suppressed Chao Yuyu in terms of speed. So, nobody could tell the real upper limit of his speed. Damn it. You've left me no choice but to use this. Chao Yuyu secretly cursed. He suddenly stopped inside the void, and stood steadily. Then he emitted endless divine beams. They spread all around overwhelmingly, and soon shrouded the entire sky. You're gravely mistaken if you think that this will work. Yi Shiwen coldly snorted. Then, a big hand suddenly stretched out. It grabbed those divine beams, and pinched them to explode. However, a huge stone tablet fell down from the sky before Yi Shiwen could carefully examine what was going on. It was exuding an enormously powerful coercion. It seemed as if it would completely crush Yi Shiwen. The word demon was engraved on top of this tablet. And it was exuding a strange demonic light. It seemed as if a great demon had resurrected in an instant. And that demon's ominous demonic eyes were seemingly staring at Yi Shiwen in a firm manner. Yi Zaiwen's complexion changed when he saw this. This was an incomplete but top-tier great sage tool. It was surely incomplete. However, it had displayed the power to extinguish the world. Someone exclaimed loudly from the sidelines since they had recognized the origin of this stone tablet. Could it be that so-called demon-inscribed tablet? Isn't it one of those demon-repellent tablets? Indeed. It's the demon-inscribed tablet. The legends say that Mu Shengjie had obtained 2 inscribed tablets from an ancient ruin. The 2 words are individually inscribed on them demon-repellent. And the 2 tablets combine to form an incomparably formidable great sage tool. Moreover, it's a top-tier great sage tool. I had never expected that Mu Xingjie would be so fond of Chao Yuyu that he would have even lent the demon-inscribed tablet to him. Everyone's complexion suddenly changed. All of them had started to believe that Yi Shiwen would win. However, they suddenly felt that Chao Yuyu's chances of winning were bigger now. After all, the disparity between a great sage tool and a sage tool was similar to the difference between great sage realm and sage realm. There was an essential disparity. It was merely an incomplete great sage tool. However, it could still annihilate a senior sage expert with ease. Yi Shiwen had continuously displayed magical powers and incredible strength. But even a person like him couldn't be a match for a great sage tool. Yi Ziwen's expressions had naturally become solemn the moment he had seen this demon-inscribed tablet. Chapter 595. The demon-inscribed tablet is mine. Yi Shiwen very clearly knew that there was a huge disparity between a sage tool and great sage tool. Therefore, he had tried many methods to make the heavenly source mirror break through. He wanted this top sage tool to become a great sage tool. After all, he would have a big hidden strength once he had a great sage tool in his hands. Great sage experts that used sage tools could be found everywhere. The Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo was an example of this. He was indeed a great sage expert. However, it was clear that he was only a mediocre one. Therefore, he used merely a top sage tool. He didn't have a great sage tool. It didn't matter whether a person wanted to fight against a great sage expert or escape from the hands of one. It would become very easy if that person possessed a great sage tool. However, this also shows how dreadful a great sage tool can be. An ordinary sage expert would be crushed and reduced to ashes if they were attacked with even an incomplete great sage tool. The sage realm and great sage realm might differ by only one realm. However, there was a difference of heaven and earth between their strengths. The demon-inscribed tablet looked like a small hill. The word demon was especially emitting dazzling rays of light. It seemed as if an endless pressure had firmly locked Yi Shiwen in an instant. It wasn't known who had created this demon's repellent tablet. However, he ought to be an almighty expert, and that too an extremely powerful one. Otherwise, he couldn't have refined such a scary great sage tool. Suddenly, the word demon hazily transformed into a big demon. It then opened its mouth like a sacrificial bowl and rushed down towards Yi Shiwen to bite him. The master who had inscribed this word in the tablet must possess incomparably dreadful skill and understanding of Tao, thanks to which he had created such a tablet. This is bad. This man of the law enforcement hall is despicable. He was hiding a great sage tool up his sleeve. It seems that younger brother will suffer a loss this time. Yang Wenjun was present on the nearby hidden star peak. He became very anxious as he looked at Yi Shiwen in the sky. There was a great shortage of sage tools for the experts who had recently entered the sage realm. However, it was a completely different thing for Yang Wenjun and Deng Shui Exin. Hidden Star Peak didn't have too many members. However, there were only 2 words that could describe their background: deep and strong. The benefit of this unfathomable background was visible in the sense that many sage experts of past generations had left behind many sage tools for them to choose from. However, a great sage tool was a completely different thing. After all, it had the power to suppress ferocious sage experts. These 2 didn't have the qualifications to possess such a tool, only Bai Jiansong possessed one. However, it didn't mean that they didn't have any knowledge about it. They also knew that this great sage tool was so dreadful that Yi Shiwen might suffer a crushing defeat. Deng Shui Exin was standing on the side. She didn't say anything. However, her face also exposed a worried look. Though Bai Jiansong didn't look so anxious. Instead, he smiled as he said, "Not necessarily. Younger brother has always been wise. He has always had all kinds of schemes up his sleeve. So, I don't believe that he won't have any contingency plans." Yang Wenjun and Deng Shui Exin let out a sigh of relief after they heard Bai Jiansong's words. They might not believe their own eyes. However, they believed those of Bai Jiansong. Yi Shiwen, grab it. the heavenly source mirror would instantly evolve into a great sage tool if it swallowed this demon-inscribed tablet. Yi Mo's excited voice suddenly echoed in Yi Ziwen's ears. Yi Shiwen became hyped up. He had tried many methods in these last years in order to evolve the heavenly source mirror into a great sage tool. In fact, he had even tried many variations of those methods. However, all of them had turned out to be vague and futile. Therefore, the heavenly source mirror hadn't transformed even a bit. An ordinary great sage expert couldn't make a great sage tool. It could be crafted only by the powerful great sage experts who possessed extremely profound cultivation. Yi Shiwen knew that he would always fall short of making such a thing. After all, his cultivation was very inferior at present. It didn't matter what he thought. It was simply impossible for a sage expert to craft a great sage tool. All of the methods he had come up with had turned out futile. However, he couldn't have expected that he would hear Yi Mo saying that there was a way for the heavenly source mirror to make the breakthrough and become a great sage tool. Therefore, he was overjoyed to hear this. He firmly looked at the demon-inscribed tablet. The demon-inscribed tablet suddenly began to shake. It shook violently, and plenty of words rippled out from inside. These words destroyed the void in an instant, and emitted endless rays of light as the tablet smashed down towards Yi Shiwen. Insignificant technique. Bring it on. Yi Shiwen shouted disdainfully. Then, a big hand stretched out, and suddenly grabbed the tablet. It seemed as if he had grabbed a wing dangling down from the sky. Bang! The sound of a giant explosion was heard along with a metal clanging sound. The demon-inscribed tablet suddenly shook, and the sounds of vibrations spread in all directions. A string of blood drops flew out in the air. It was Yi Ziwen's blood. A wound had been opened in his hand, and blood had splashed out when he had fiercely grabbed at the demon-inscribed tablet just now. He was left dumbstruck. This was the first time that he had sustained injuries in this fight with Chao Yuyu so far. In fact, it could be said that he hadn't sustained injuries since a very long time. He also hadn't used the magical phoenix regeneration technique since a long time. The last time he had sustained injuries was when he had faced a great sage expert whose strength was far superior to his. However, he hadn't sustained injuries since a long time while facing other opponents of the same level. And the situation was same even when he was facing Chao Yuyu, who was a Heaven's Pride expert from the Law Enforcement Hall. He had practiced his Gilded Tyrant form to the 7th layer. So, his body had become tough to an incredible degree. He had certainly sustained injuries at this time. However, it wasn't that his Gilded Tyrant form was weak. Instead, it was due to the fact that this tablet was way too tyrannical. Yi Shiwen was stunned by this, but Chao Yuyu was even more surprised, so much so that he almost couldn't conceal what he was feeling. Yi Shiwen was left dumbstruck because his Gilded Tyrant form had been destroyed by this tablet. But Chao Yuyu was even more surprised. Yi Shiwen didn't know this. But Chao Yuyu was well aware of that fact that he had been lent this incredible tablet only for an hour. He must return it to Mi Xingjie once the time was up. This great sage tool was so dreadful that it could grab the stars, seize the moon, destroy the heaven, and extinguish the earth. However, Yi Shiwen had grabbed at it with his bare hands and hadn't been crushed into pieces while doing so. The wound on Yi Ziwen's hand was neither worth mentioning nor worth paying attention to. It was simply a joke. After all, was such a tiny wound worth making any fuss about? It was indeed a trivial wound. However, Chao Yuyu still became excited when he saw that Yi Shiwen had sustained injuries. The present situation wasn't like earlier when all of his attacks had looked insignificant in front of Yi Shiwen. They hadn't had any effect on Yi Shiwen. In fact, it had seemed as if an ordinary person had been punching a wall. It had no use apart from hurting oneself. However, his attack had caused an impact on Yi Shiwen this time. So, this had roused his spirits. The demon-inscribed tablet pressed down towards Yi Shiwen once again under Chao Yuyu's control. It transformed into a huge demon in an instant, opened its mouth like a sacrificial bowl. Then, it smashed down towards Yi Shiwen to swallow him. Demon flames in the heavenly paradise within the starry sky. This big demon was made up of an incomplete Great Sage tool. So, it revealed the faint might of Great Sage realm in its attacks. An ordinary sage expert would have been screwed if they had come across it. After all, it was simply impossible to contend against such a Great Sage tool. However, Yi Shiwen could even grab and kill an expert of initial stage of Great Sage realm if he summoned the Star Colossus avatar. Therefore, he didn't need to be afraid of it. Yi Shiwen had already decided to grab this demon-inscribed tablet since he wanted Yi Mo to swallow it. Therefore, he stretched out a hand without any hesitation. It transformed into a big and fiery hand, and swept towards the demon-inscribed tablet to grab it. Yi Shiwen opened his mouth, and spouted a few mouthfuls of primary essence in succession. The fire cloud's falling sky hand became even bigger after absorbing his essence. Even its imposing aura became vaster. Yi Ziwen's body was very tough. However, the recent bleeding in his hand had allowed him to conclude that he still lacked strength when it came to contending against a Great Sage tool. Therefore, he had increased the might of his fire cloud's falling sky hand by immersing some of his own primary essence into it. However, Yi Ziwen's complexion had become deathly pale. The fact was that it wasn't a small thing for him to spout so much primary essence. It could even damage his source. Very few experts would use such a move. And even these few experts wouldn't do so unless they were in a critical situation. However, Yi Ziwen's complexion became florid once again within a split second. The cry of Phoenix was faintly emitting from his body. The Phoenix regeneration technique was at work. Bang! The violent collision caused a huge turbulence in the entire world. Yi Ziwen's big hand had finally clutched the demon-inscribed tablet. You're very stupid. This Great Sage tool has been especially refined by Senior Brother Mu. You think someone like you can hold it? You're courting it? You're courting death. It's courting death no matter how profound your cultivation is, or how formidable your body is. Chao Yuyu burst into laughter. It seemed as if he was seeing Yi Ziwen's moment of death. He was unceasingly changing the hand seals. It seemed as if that demon-inscribed tablet was receiving a big stimulation as Chao Yuyu changed the hand seals. It had started to emit incredible rays of light, and it seemed as if it would definitely set itself free from Yi Ziwen's grip. Poochie! Yi Ziwen's blood splashed out and sprinkled all around. Even the golden divinities were mixed with it. Everyone's eyes became wide open as they saw this scene. Yi Shiwen hasn't sustained injuries in the entire fight. But he's being repeatedly injured by the demon-inscribed tablet now. Blood is gushing out from his hand like a hurricane. Could it be that Chao Yuyu's admonishing remark is valid? Is it true that Yi Shiwen is overestimating his capabilities? Is he following the path of his doom? Humph! It's just a divine tool, and he dares to be so arrogant. Yi Shiwen coldly snorted. He then raised his arm against the wind, and endless divinities rushed along his hand like a great river. The majestic divinities gathered in his palm. They then transformed into a god spirit, and suppressed the tool spirit that was present inside the demon-inscribed tablet. The fact that the tool spirit of the Great Sage tool had been suppressed meant that this Great Sage tool had finally fallen into Yi Ziwen's hands. Yi Ziwen's blood was dripping little by little through his wrist, and falling onto the ground. His blood was a treasure. Even the weeds would transform into elixirs if a few drops of his blood fell onto the ground. His blood was miraculous. The demon-inscribed tablet issued a sharp demon-like scream with the unceasing influx of Yi Ziwen's divinities into it. It was obvious that it was in extreme pain because it had been completely suppressed by Yi Shiwen. Yi Ziwen's blood was still gushing out at a frightening speed. However, there was still a smiling expression on his face. How is this possible? Chao Yuyu looked incredulously at Yi Ziwen's hand. Yi Ziwen's hand hadn't been disintegrated by the demon-inscribed tablet. On the contrary, it appeared as if the demon-inscribed tablet had been suppressed by it. This demon-inscribed tablet is mine. However, Yi Ziwen's voice hadn't even fallen when a scary energy surged out from inside the demon-inscribed tablet. Then, a majestic and sacred power swept out in a flash. Chapter 596 defeats Qiao Yuyu. A scary energy surged out from the demon-inscribed tablet. A majestic and sacred power had swept out in a flash. Audacious! A cold shout emitted from the demon-inscribed tablet. Yi Shiwen responded almost immediately. It's Mu Xingjie. He quickly realized that this demon-inscribed tablet was Mu Xingjie's divine tool. It had been lent to Qiao Yuyu. However, it still belonged to Mu Xingjie in the end. Therefore, this divine tool contained Mu Xingjie's wisp of soul inside it. That wisp of soul usually remained in deep sleep. However, it had awakened when a tyrannical person like Yi Shiwen had tried to seize the demon-inscribed tablet. Everyone's eyes became wide open as they saw this scene. They secretly held their breath. Is Yi Ziwen's tyrant body technique so much powerful? His sage-level body doesn't disintegrate under the demon-inscribed tablet. Many people had thoroughly researched about Yi Ziwen's tyrant body technique when he had abruptly risen to fame. Everyone knew that his tyrant body technique was very powerful. However, it was useless for them. A lot of people had secretly obtained the tyrant body technique. However, they had been left dumbstruck when they had seen that there was only one layer intact. One could cultivate at most in the Hotian realm with one layer. Therefore, it was of little value for these people. These people had further verified the news that they had obtained from the all-knowing scholar. They had then arrived at the conclusion that Yi Shiwen had himself deduced the further layers of the tyrant body technique by relying upon his own capability. Therefore, these people couldn't do anything about their incapability even though they envied and hated Yi Shiwen. These people could only look at Yi Ziwen's tyrant body technique in helplessness. But they couldn't do anything. They had only seen the first layer which could be cultivated in the Hotian realm. However, they could tell that the tyrant body technique was a very high-level technique. It was claimed that the practitioner could even tear apart the devils and gods with bare hands after they reached the highest layer. Perhaps, this wasn't just an exaggerated statement. In fact, they couldn't even say that they could deduce all layers of an ordinary power technique with ease. They would have a hard time doing so even if it were just an imitation. Therefore, they were completely helpless when faced with the tyrant body technique. After all, the tyrant body technique was incredible. It was far beyond their expectations. However, it was still facing a great sage tool. They couldn't imagine that a sage expert could grab a great sage tool with their bare hands even if it was an incomplete one. Several sage experts had come and gone. However, Yi Shiwen might be the only one who had managed to pull off something like this. Blood was unceasingly gushing out from Yi Ziwen's hand. However, his hand hadn't disintegrated. This was already a miracle. I would have given you some value if your main form had been present in front of me. However, it's only a wisp of your soul, that's all. So, I'll just suppress it. Yi Shiwen scoffed as a seemingly endless golden light suddenly emitted from his bloody hand. His divinities surged out and suppressed the demon-inscribed tablet. How dare you! Qiao Yuyu was startled by this development. Then he became angry. He hadn't expected that Yi Shiwen would dare to attack the demon-inscribed tablet. Mu Xingjie was like a god to him. So, this act of Yi Ziwen's was like profanity in his eyes. Qiao Yuyu had never suffered a loss since his debut. He had never fallen into a disadvantageous position while facing his peers. However, he had repeatedly suffered losses at the hands of Yi Shiwen. Moreover, Yi Shiwen could be regarded as his junior. He could have somehow come to terms with this. However, Yi Shiwen had also dared to attack the divine tool of his senior brother Mu, a man who was a godlike figure for him. Yi Shiwen had gone too far in Qiao Yuyu's opinion. A real elemental energy broke out from Qiao Yuyu's body amidst a roaring sound. And it seemed as if the meridians on his face would explode. I want you dead. Qiao Yuyu went crazy. A big hand stretched out and suddenly issued a world-shaking imposing aura. Then, his body flashed intensely. This made him look like a white lightning. The inexhaustible real elemental energy on his skin issued strange ripples which made him look like a crazy dragon. Chao Yuyu looked at Yi Shiwen with an exceptionally vicious expression in his eyes. He then assembled all kinds of magical powers and martial techniques, and threw them towards Yi Shiwen all at once. Yi Shiwen had also become angry. He didn't loathe Chao Yuyu like earlier. However, that didn't mean that he would let Chao Yuyu act presumptuously in front of him. Yi Shiwen raised his hand. Countless golden lights emitted from his hand and interweaved to form a huge net. Chao Yuyu's speed was very quick. However, Yi Ziwen's interweaved network was even quicker. It had shrouded Chao Yuyu in an instant. Rumble. A violent explosion occurred when the net bumped into Chao Yuyu's body. It seemed as if Chao Yuyu had stepped on a landmine. Blood splashed out from Chao Yuyu's body, and his body shivered violently. His body had been ruptured to some extent, and it seemed as if it would disintegrate in the next moment. Chao Yuyu spared no effort to stabilize his soul in order to prevent his body from collapsing. It's needless to say that the body is extremely important for an expert. In fact, the body is the foundation of practicing martial arts. One doesn't have anything if one doesn't have a body. Therefore, Chao Yuyu couldn't let his body collapse. He would suffer heavy losses if his body collapsed, even if his spirit survived. After all, his vitality would get severely damaged if this happened. However, it didn't matter how much he resisted. Yi Ziwen's martial power was much more tyrannical than his. Chao Yuyu had finally understood that Yi Shiwen couldn't be measured on the basis of realm. He was a monster. Poof! Chao Yuyu's soul also sustained serious injuries. Finally, he couldn't help but spout a mouthful of blood. However, it wasn't ordinary blood. Instead, it was his blood essence which contained his vitality. He had failed to keep it suppressed, and had ended up spouting a mouthful of it. His cultivation had reduced by 1/3 after he spouted just a mouthful of blood. Yi Shiwen was thinking of attacking further. However, the demon-inscribed tablet in his hand emitted even more dreadful rays of light than before. Then, a wisp of soul suddenly emerged out from inside it. Yi Shiwen was surprised to see the shadow of a figure ascending from it. This figure possessed unparalleled ominous power. It was Mu Xingjie's soul fragment. It had ruptured Yi Ziwen's palm in one fell swoop. Chao Yuyu had escaped the peril on the other side. However, his vitality had sustained huge injuries after he had spouted a mouthful of blood essence. He didn't even have the strength to stay afloat anymore. He fell down from the sky and smashed onto a pile of rocks. His life was saved, but he had obviously been crippled now. However, Yi Shiwen didn't have time to care about whether Chao Yuyu was dead or alive at this moment. It was because Mu Xingjie's soul present before him had exerted a huge coercion on him. It was just a wisp of soul. However, it had exerted more pressure on him than Chao Yuyu had. Chao Yuyu had arrived here in person. However, he was merely an expert of initial stage of half-step Great Sage realm. But Mu Xingjie was a genuine Great Sage expert on the other hand. In fact, he was a top-tier Great Sage expert. He lost. I hadn't expected that Chao Yuyu would lose. Yi Shiwen is outrageously strong. He's far more than just outrageously strong. Chao Yuyu is an expert of initial stage of half-step Great Sage realm. And Yi Shiwen is only a Sage Small Perfection level expert. A Sage Small Perfection level expert should have been nothing in front of Chao Yuyu. However, he has defeated Chao Yuyu. It's truly a miracle. It seems that you don't know. Yi Shiwen belongs to our generation. And our generation has the most powerful people. Will also excel in the future. So, you old people will regret it in the future if you try to bully us. Cut the crap. You can talk about being ferocious, but it's only Yi Shiwen who is ferocious. You lot are nothing. You want to hoot in front of this old man. You're still several hundred years behind. There are many geniuses in this world. However, I can say with confidence that there isn't any genius in this generation who can surpass Yi Shiwen. A Sage Small Perfection level expert has repelled an expert of initial stage of half-step Great Sage realm. Just hearing about such incredible strength can scare a person to death. Everyone on the hidden star peak is abnormal and monstrous. I would have chosen the hidden star peak if I had known this earlier. The hidden star peak may become a popular choice for everyone in the next session. I've heard that Huang Wuji and the others are about to return. The hidden star peak may see a resurgence at that time. Several of the disciples who were watching the fight had become excited after Yi Shiwen had defeated Qiao Yuyu with ease. After all, nobody had been optimistic that Yi Shiwen could defeat Qiao Yuyu in the beginning. However, Yi Shiwen had accomplished it. Moreover, he had defeated Qiao Yuyu while fooling around. It didn't seem that Yi Shiwen had lacked by one realm as compared to Qiao Yuyu. There was a lot of noise in the surroundings since everyone was discussing. However, Yi Shiwen didn't look relaxed. He was staring at the wisp of soul that was present before him. After all, it was a much bigger problem for him than Qiao Yuyu had been. The Phoenix regeneration technique could restore Yi Ziwen's injuries at an astonishing speed. However, it couldn't do so instantly. After all, the injuries sustained by a great sage tool couldn't heal so quickly. You're very courageous. However, I hadn't expected that you would amount to anything, Mu Xingjie said. His overbearing gaze was shining on Yi Ziwen's body. Mu Xingjie's words suddenly made the entire world quiet. Everyone was looking at him. They knew that another battle between two giants might break out soon. Moreover, it would be a much more intense battle than the previous one. Everyone again looked at Yi Shiwen under this pin-drop silence. They didn't know how he would react. However, they knew to what extent this situation could grow. Therefore, they were trying to see Yi Ziwen's reaction. The fight could begin just the way the people of Law Enforcement Hall wanted. However, how it would end was beyond their control. Could it be that you're having regrets? Yi Shiwen grinned. It seemed as if he wasn't facing a big shot of the Law Enforcement Hall. Instead, it seemed as if he was facing an ordinary person. In fact, he was even talking with a bit of sarcasm. Mu Xingjie might have already crushed Yi Shiwen to death if he had attacked him personally in their previous confrontation. However, he had unfortunately used a wisp of his soul avatar at that time, and that wisp of soul had been defeated by Yi Shiwen. Regret. Mu Xingjie let out a disdainful expression from the corner of his mouth. He hadn't said it clearly. However, his words contained contempt for Yi Shiwen. Yi Ziwen's growth was indeed beyond Mu Xingjie's expectation. However, Mu Xingjie believed that Yi Shiwen still fell far short when it came to making him regret. He believed that an ant would remain an ant even if it grew up. He himself was like an eagle in the sky. And his goal was the sea of stars. So, he couldn't care less about the ants crawling on the ground. You're merely a wisp of soul. So, why are you so arrogant? I've won this fight, and this demon-inscribed tablet is my spoil of war. Yi Shiwen didn't pay attention to the disdainful look in Mu Xingjie's eyes, and just opened his mouth to smile. Yi Shiwen had smiled in a mocking manner. His smile was very much like sunlight. Everyone went in uproar. Did he just challenge Mu Xingjie to his face? It's indeed just a wisp of his soul. However, challenging Mu Xingjie is an entirely different matter as compared to challenging Qiao Yuyu. Chapter 597. The curtain drops. However, not everyone was thinking that. Some people knew that it wasn't the first time that Yi Shiwen had challenged Mu Xingjie. It was just a wisp of his soul. But still, only a few people would dare to challenge him. However, Yi Shiwen had already challenged him twice by now. The people who knew that Yi Shiwen had already challenged Mu Xingjie once in the past were very calm and collected. It had happened once. So, what if it had happened again? Yi Shiwen hadn't even reached the sage realm back then. Many people sighed with emotion. Yi Shiwen is an unruly person. He considers everyone beneath him. He doesn't even give importance to Mu Xingjie. In fact, it seems that he won't even pay attention to the Lord of the University if he gets an opportunity in the future and enters the Great Sage Realm. Yi Shiwen didn't know what these people were thinking. Otherwise, he would have expelled it as nonsense. Some people were calling him unruly. However, they seemed to have forgotten that it was Mu Xingjie who was provoking him at present. Should Yi Shiwen still have welcomed him with a smiling face? Should he have extended his face for Mu Xingjie to slap on? That wasn't Yi Ziwen's style. Their so-called rules seemed to put restrictions on him and bully him. How could he possibly submit to such humiliation? I'll shatter the heaven if it tries to suppress me. I'll trample the earth if it tries to constrain me. I'll even annihilate God if he tries to bully me. Even if they break my legs and crush my backbone. Everyone was speechlessly looking at this reckless guy. Only Yi Shiwen can dare to say that he'll keep Mu Xingjie's divine tool as his spoils of war. Wild, Mu Xingjie said. His ice-cold voice sounded like a calm ancient well. He seemed neither sad nor happy. In fact, it seemed as if he was looking at a dead man. There wasn't the least bit of emotional fluctuations on his face. Yi Shiwen didn't say anything. He was about to attack. However, a streamer of light flashed in the sky all of a sudden. Then, a figure arrived while treading the flying light. Yi Shiwen looked at that figure. It was Qi Fifan. Senior brother Qi. Yi Shiwen shouted. However, his brows wrinkled. What is Qi Fifan doing here at this time? Yi Shiwen had just returned to the true martial world. So, he hadn't gotten the time to catch up with these old friends. The former Yi Shiwen would have thought that 10 years' time was a very long period. However, the current Yi Shiwen believed that a person stayed in closed-door training for a comparatively longer time than 10 years. Yi Shiwen had experienced many things in the last 10 years. However, it wasn't a very long time for him. Therefore, he wasn't in a hurry to meet his old friends. Qi Fifan had also entered the Sage Realm peak within a short time of over a decade. And he wouldn't need many years to enter the late stage of half-step Great Sage Realm. However, his cultivation speed would also begin to drag like most of the other people soon after he'd enter the Great Sage Realm. Qi Fifan turned to look at Yi Shiwen and nodded. He didn't say anything. Then he looked towards the wisp of Mu Xingjie's soul and said, I've arrived here to present the Lord's orders to you. This battle must stop at once. The winner and loser have already been decided. So, there's no need to continue this fight. Everyone was disappointed by the fact that Qi Fifan had arrived to end this matter. However, this was a normal thing since this matter involved Yi Shiwen, Qiao Yuyu, and Mu Xingjie. These three men were invincible experts at the heights of their power, and they might become Super Heaven's Pride experts in the future. Each of these men was an exceptional expert. True Martial University didn't care too much about ordinary disciples. After all, countless people would arrive in the university in every session. In fact, the True Martial University might not be able to clearly calculate how many disciples it had. Therefore, it was impossible for the university to manage everyone's affair. However, these three men were Heaven's Pride experts. The higher-ups used to take special care of the Heaven's Pride experts of every session. Therefore, the status of these Heaven's Pride experts wasn't ordinary. Qiao Yuyu had followed Mu Xingjie on an expedition for many years. He had worked hard and had performed great service. And Yi Shiwen had also done a few great services for the university. Therefore, it would be a huge loss for True Martial University no matter who won and who lost in the fight between these two individuals. So, this was the most appropriate step under the present situation when the outcome had already been decided. Everyone quickly understood the Supreme Lord's intention. However, the two men involved in this matter frowned. It was clear that they were very much dissatisfied. Only a wisp Mu Xingjie's soul was present here. However, it still possessed extremely powerful strength. Mu Xingjie wanted to take the advantage of this opportunity and kill an unstable element like Yi Shiwen on the spot. He wanted to get rid of a potential future trouble. Any Heaven's Pride expert was a treasure for the university. Yi Shiwen had earlier killed the Titan body. But that was because the owner of Titan body, Second God, had paid a very high price for the opportunity to organize a mortal combat between himself and Yi Shiwen. In fact, even a powerhouse like Mu Xingjie had to force the high-level experts to give in for the declaration of mortal combat that Qiao Yuyu had sent to Yi Shiwen. After all, it was impossible to kill Yi Shiwen without tricks. Mu Xingjie couldn't do so even if he was rampant and domineering. After all, it would have disturbed the university's foundation. Could he treat Heaven's Pride experts like cabbages that he could cut them one by one? Every Heaven's Pride expert was a treasure that might become the backbone of the university in the future. He couldn't kill Yi Shiwen this time. And it would be troublesome for him to find another opportunity to do so. Yi Shiwen wasn't satisfied either. He had also wanted to take advantage of this opportunity and suppress the wisp of Mu Xingjie's soul. After all, he would have obtained an incomplete Great Sage tool if he had been able to do so. He would have let Yi Mo swallow it so that Heavenly Source Mirror could thoroughly transform into a Great Sage tool. Moreover, his safety factor would have increased enormously after he had the protection of a Great Sage tool. The world was so big. He could go anywhere. The Supreme Lord had personally interfered in this fight. But could this battle still continue? He didn't care about Chao Yuyu. He had already defeated him no matter if he had died or not. Humph! You're lucky today. Mu Xingjie coldly snorted. He then transformed into a streamer of light, curled up Chao Yuyu, and disappeared into the horizon. Yi Shiwen looked with his ice-cold vision in the direction in which the wisp of Mu Xingjie's soul had disappeared. It was a bit unfortunate for him. It's a pity that I've lost this opportunity. It's extremely unfortunate indeed. The Heavenly Source Mirror would have definitely entered the Great Sage realm if it had swallowed that demon-inscribed tablet. Yi Mo sighed and said, he was the one who regretted this lost opportunity the most. Inside the microcosm, behind the layers of space. Zhao Fiji's face also exposed a regretful expression as she saw this scene. It was very unfortunate that they couldn't kill Yi Shiwen this time. However, the order to stop the fight had been issued by the Supreme Lord. So, she couldn't dare to question it no matter how courageous she was. Qi Fifan also saw the unhappy expression on Yi Ziwen's face. Many people thought that Yi Shiwen had been lucky this time, and the Supreme Lord's order had saved him. However, Qi Fifan didn't think so. On the contrary, he felt that it had been more of a hindrance than a help for Yi Shiwen. Younger brother Yi has often astonished people in the last few decades. When has he not overcome a disaster? Every enemy has fallen under his feet no matter how formidable they had been. Yi Shiwen was a Heaven's Pride expert just like his opponent the legendary Mu Xingjie. However, he was far less experienced than him. Qi Fifan had heard too many things about Mu Xingjie after arriving at the true martial university. However, Yi Ziwen's opponent at present was merely a wisp of Mu Xingjie's soul. It was indeed formidable. But it wasn't unbeatable for Yi Shiwen. After all, Yi Shiwen had always been wise and full of all kinds of tricks. Qi Fifan looked at Yi Shiwen with a sense of apology. He said, I'm sorry, young Yi. It seems that I've interfered in your business. Yi Shiwen grinned, and didn't nag about this issue. He then said, what happened? How come this matter has alarmed the Supreme Lord? Yi Shiwen knew that Qi Fifan used to work under the Supreme Lord. In fact, it was said that he had become his favorite disciple. Moreover, there were rumors about him being one of the candidates for the position of the Lord in the future. However, Yi Shiwen knew that these were merely rumors. After all, someone who wanted to take the position of the Lord must convince the masses of their strength. The true martial university was a big organization, and it had been functioning since countless years. So, it already had a set method to decide this. Candidate selection wasn't necessarily in control of the main authorities. One must possess decision-making ability and enough tyrannical strength. These things were most important. Qi Fifan's strength was still too weak as far as becoming the Lord of True Martial University was concerned. After all, a sage expert like him was nothing in comparison to those frequent great sage competitors. The results would be revealed after several hundred years. The Supreme Lord would retire from his position, and the competition for the position of the Lord would become intense. It's not like that. Many old and high-level experts are alarmed since this fight also involved Mu Xingjie. You must know that these old experts are very optimistic about Mu Xingjie. They want him to take over the position of the University Lord. Qi Fifan somewhat helplessly said. take over the position of the university lord. This matter will take place after several hundred years. Who can say with certainty that it'll be Mu Xingjie who takes over? Yi Shiwen let out a grin from the corner of his mouth and replied. Mu Xingjie was a popular candidate. However, it wasn't certain that he would be chosen. For example, Big Brother Huang Wuji was also a popular candidate. However, Huang Wuji had a flaw. And this flaw was that the hidden star peak wasn't influential enough. It only had a few people. So, they couldn't give him a strong support. It seems that the Lord is very optimistic about you, senior brother. In fact, senior brother might also have a chance after several hundred years. Yi Shiwen laughed and said. Yi Shiwen wasn't interested in the position of the Lord. So, it would be better if Qi Fifan occupied the top position instead of Mu Xingjie. After all, Yi Shiwen would come across very few troublesome matters in that case. Yi Shiwen pondered a little and understood the Lord's intention behind sending Qi Fifan. It didn't matter who would have won in this fight. Qi Fifan would have gained the gratitude of one of the two parties involved. And this would have increased his support base. However, this tactic had obviously failed. Neither side had bought it. Instead, both sides had felt that they would have smoothly settled the opposite party if Qi Fifan hadn't interfered. However, Qi Fifan hadn't figured it out yet. Therefore, he didn't dare to wait for the situation to become dire. After all, his intervention would have been pointless in that case. Well, this matter will take place after several hundred years. So, nobody can say for sure. Qi Fifan didn't directly deny. After all, he also harbored ambitions when it came to the Supreme Lord's position. However, he didn't possess the strength required for this position. So, he must quietly continue to improve his strength through cultivation and wait patiently. On the contrary, I must congratulate younger brother. You disappeared for about 10 years, and your strength has already far surpassed mine now. Qi Fifan said the truth. He was also proud and arrogant. However, this was the only thing he could say while facing Yi Shiwen, who used to be far behind him back then. Qi Fifan had entered the Sage Realm and cultivated to the Sage Realm peak in the last 10 years. It was very fast speed. However, it was simply nothing when compared to that of Yi Shiwen. They are tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.